Chapter 595. In the middle of the night, the chaos was still ongoing. However, at the top of a hill in the center of the valley, a blazing flame suddenly lit up. Then, numerous sparks started to gather together. Soon, thousands of barbarians formed a solid defensive line that protected the entire hill. After a while, more than 10 chiefs of various tribes came together. They looked at each other with an ugly face. Especially when they saw the young commander, they lowered their heads in shame and walked a few steps forward to pay their respects. That's right, the young commander who gave them a night's time in the evening finally couldn't hold back and entered the valley personally. Without any courtesy, the young commander looked around and said coldly, "Now I'm in command." Yes. The dozen or so tribal chiefs lowered their heads even more when they heard the order. They wanted to lower their heads to the crotch of their pants and replied in a muffled voice. They were extremely sullen and depressed. Of course, no one would feel good if their command was taken away by a big shot when they didn't do a good job. However, they couldn't complain about it. It wasn't that the other party didn't give them a chance. They had even created an excellent situation for them. They forced the 2 brandmasters to close in on the valley. But under such circumstances, they spent a whole day and suffered heavy casualties. But they couldn't even capture one of them. No matter how they looked at it, it was not justifiable. Tell me the details of the situation of the 2 brandmasters. Looking at the fierce fighting sound from time to time, the young commander didn't turn his head and asked directly. The leaders of the dozen tribes looked at each other. In the end, one of them stepped forward and bowed. "She's still on the run, but she's under our control. Yes, that brand woman is at the end of her rope. Her holy aura is about to run out. Our warriors can already hurt her, and I believe that we'll be able to kill her soon." There was a lot of hesitation in his words. Naturally, he wasn't convinced. But that was the truth. Sylvia was still Sylvia. Even if she didn't rely on her warrior aura, ordinary barbarians still couldn't compete with her. And that lunatic Bran, He paused for a moment, and only when the young commander turned his head away in dissatisfaction did the clan leader continue with a troubled expression. "He's still under control. His situation is a little special. He's even more skilled than that Bran woman. If a normal squad were to bump into him, they would be wiped out in a short period of time. And when he bumped into a big team, he suddenly left after fighting for a while. His speed is too fast. We can't catch up with him." Compared to Sylvia's hesitation, the chief's attitude towards Tang En was more complicated. Of course, this was normal. When Tang En's ghost body, he didn't pay attention to logic. As long as someone wanted to kill him, he would immediately enter a state of killing. Moreover, Tang En's speed and hiding were extremely good. If the barbarians weren't fully prepared, they would only suffer casualties. They wouldn't be able to stop him. After pondering for a while, the young commander looked pensive and asked again, "Where was the last battle?" He paused and looked at the fierce battle on the right. "And that crazy guy." A chief of a tribe walked out and pointed to the left. "Over there, beside the tallest mountain." The young commander looked along the arm and narrowed his eyes. He frowned and looked strained. Fortunately, Sheeny stepped forward and whispered a few words in his ear. Nodding his head, the young commander continued to ask for some details. For example, the location of each tribe's soldiers, the casualties, and so on. She closed her eyes and pondered for a while. Then, she gave clear orders to each tribe's chief. Some of these orders were relatively simple. For example, she asked a tribe's men to go to a place and set up a stable defense line. Unless they received her orders, they weren't allowed to move at all. Some of the orders were very complicated and detailed. They even detailed the route of each 100-man team, how to deal with unexpected situations, and so on. As such, some of the barbarian tribe's chiefs were dizzy. They couldn't wait to rip open their heads and put these orders in. However, the young commander seemed to have realized this problem. He asked Sheeny to pass them a pen and paper, and let them write it down one by one. It was also at this time that some of the chiefs realized the strangeness and terror of these orders. Regardless of the actual effect of these orders, just looking at these complicated orders, it was enough to completely summarize the situation of the tribe's military strength. One must know that they had more than 10 people. Moreover, it was just a simple verbal description. This young commander didn't record anything. He only pondered for a while. Not only did he remember all the contents, he also completed the planning, organizing, and other matters. There wasn't a single mistake. The hill was silent. Without waiting for these chiefs to recover from their shock, Sheeny suddenly pointed down and screamed. There, someone is coming. There were many people around the hill. This young commander's identity seemed to be somewhat special. Therefore, about a tribe's soldiers had set up a tight defense line. Now, to be able to make Sheeny scream like this, it naturally couldn't be a barbarian. Hearing this, the people on the peak rushed over. Looking down, they easily saw a figure in blood-red robes slowly wandering around. At this time, the barbarians below also saw this strange figure. There was a small disturbance, but it was suppressed in an instant. Bows were drawn and arrows were nocked. The atmosphere suddenly became extremely tense. That figure in blood-red robes seemed to have felt the cold killing intent. His figure suddenly stopped outside the range of the arrows. He first turned to look at the thousands of barbarians in front of him, then looked up at the peak. Sheeny was more timid. She immediately took 3 steps back and sucked in a breath of cold air. Her face was somewhat pale. What kind of eyes were those? Although there was a distance of 100 meters, those blood-red demonic eyes seemed to reflect directly into the hearts of everyone. Cold, crazy, murderous, all kinds of negative emotions mixed together. It made people's hair stand on end and they secretly swallowed their saliva. Damn it, it's that crazy Bran! This image was so unique that a tribe leader couldn't help but cry out. The other tribe leaders naturally recognized him as well. Their bodies instantly stiffened, and there was a bit of panic in their nervousness. After all, they were just discussing how to deal with this person. Who would have thought that the other party would directly send himself to them, narrowing his eyes? The young commander also seemed to feel that the blood-red eyes were too demonic. He slightly tilted his head and decisively ordered, "Pass down the order. The 2 sides of the team at the foot of the mountain are to surround him immediately." No. A tribe leader heard this and disregarded the difference in status. He immediately rejected. This madman's strength is very high. Without full preparation, we can't stop him at all. And if he takes the opportunity to break through, He didn't finish his sentence, but there was no doubt that he was worried about the young commander's safety. No problem. Waving his hand, the young commander said calmly, "This is just a test. It's better to see for yourself. As long as the archers in front don't move, he won't be able to rush up." That was the logic, but the other tribe leaders had already been traumatized by this madman. They resolutely disagreed. However, the young commander's power was very strong. Once the order was given, André and the others would convey it. He didn't care about these opposing voices at all. Soon, the barbarians guarding the 2 sides of the mountain put away their bows and raised their iron rods. They slowly surrounded him from both sides. The man in blood-red clothes didn't seem to notice and continued to stare at the people at the top of the mountain. Not knowing if it was an illusion or something, the young commander only felt that the pair of blood-red eyes were looking at her, as if he had already determined that she was the mastermind behind this encirclement. Finally, when the barbarians who were carefully approaching from both sides were about to complete the encirclement, Kiki, the night owl-like laughter sounded again. Then, with a flash of blood-red light, the figure of the man in blood-red clothes suddenly disappeared. When he appeared again, he was already in front of the barbarians on the left side. F***ck. André subconsciously clenched his fist. His face instantly became gloomy. He already knew that this madman Bran was very fast. He also learned about it from the tribe leaders just now. But when he saw it with his own eyes, André still couldn't hold back the shock in his heart. He subconsciously cursed. With such speed, even if he didn't have any fighting energy, it wasn't something he could compete with, let alone these ordinary soldiers. The battle below wasn't very suspenseful. In front of the ghost-like man in blood-red clothes, the attacks of the ordinary northern wilderness soldiers were extremely slow. Even if they had brute strength, they couldn't dodge a stab to the heart. Sydney couldn't bear to watch anymore. She covered her eyes tightly with both hands and retreated. The young commander at the side was calm. He stared without blinking. There was a look of inquiry in his eyes, as if he was thinking about how to surround this guy and kill him. However, when everyone at the top of the mountain was silent, suddenly, Kiki! The night owl-like laughter disappeared and was replaced by a mournful scream. The man in blood-red clothes who was about to break out of the encirclement suddenly hugged his head. His body flashed wildly and in the end, he simply lay on the ground and rolled rapidly, raising clouds of dust. Get out. No, get back, I haven't played enough. Get back. Get back. Get back. Everyone at the top of the mountain couldn't help but look at each other. Their faces were full of confusion. What was going on? Not to mention them, even the surrounding barbarians couldn't help but retreat. They looked at the man in blood-red clothes, who seemed to have suddenly gone crazy. They didn't know what to do for a moment. Fortunately, this crazy action didn't last for long. With an extremely unwilling roar, the blood-red-robed man who was rolling on the ground suddenly stopped. After a moment, he shook his head and slowly crawled up from the ground. He patted the dust on his body and looked around at the surrounding barbarians. As if he felt something, he raised his head and looked at the top of the mountain again. His long and narrow eyes slightly narrowed. The corners of his mouth suddenly rose, revealing an evil smile. Then, he raised his right hand and slowly pulled it across his throat. It was a standard throat-cutting gesture. Whoosh! After doing all this, his body suddenly flashed and disappeared from the spot. When he reappeared, he had already escaped the encirclement and was running away. On the top of the mountain, the young commander felt the provocation of the man in blood-red clothes. He curled his lips and expressionlessly waved his hand and ordered, "Follow the original plan and move." Yes, at the same time, in an unknown space, well inside Tangin's brain. The old butler quietly looked at the hologram in front of him with his hands behind his back. The hologram was showing the crazy scene of Tang unrolling on the ground a moment ago. He waved his hand and the hologram disappeared. What appeared was a densely packed list of things. The old butler's line of sight moved down and finally stopped at the bottom of the skill tree column. That was the original position of the ghost body skill. However, there were some changes now. Evil body, advanced ghost body skill. Hold the Azura weapon and move through 3000 battlefield. Can be upgraded. Upgrade method. Use this skill to reap a certain number of lives. Skill time, 15 minutes. Consumption of blood and chi, 5000 points. P.S. Ghost body can be upgraded. This was explained before. You didn't expect Raccoon to do this. Kaka. TSK, a small spoiler. The following plot is more. Well, it's very good and very powerful. Let's advertise again. There are more than 100 automatic subscriptions. However, there are only 5 Great God's Glory. If you want this sticky paper, quickly use the Great God's Glory to smash Raccoon to death. Finally, nonsense doesn't count. Carrot. Chapter 596. Swoosh. Rustle. In a small forest, a blurry figure suddenly broke into it. Without stopping, the figure stepped on the dead branches and decayed leaves and moved forward quickly. However, after running for about 3 minutes, the figure suddenly staggered and crashed into a bush. Although it happened suddenly, it was obvious that the person was very skillful. The figure subconsciously made a few evasive movements in the air and successfully avoided most of the thorns on the bush. At this moment, before the figure could get up, sparks suddenly lit up not far away, and the sound of messy footsteps could be heard. Thud, thud, thud. Where is she? I just saw. She's injured and can't run far. She must be nearby. You guys go over there. You take some people over there. The rest of you, follow me. The messy footsteps gradually faded away, and the hundreds of burly figures soon disappeared. The area also dimmed, and night fell again. Suddenly, huff, huff, the sound of heavy breathing was suddenly heard. It was rapid and hurried, like a severely injured wild wolf. From this sound, one could tell that the person was not in a good condition. However, after more than 10 breaths, the sound was forcibly suppressed. Then, the grass turned, and the figure stood up from the bush. She looked around, her chest rising and falling. As if she did not sense the danger, she stepped over the bush, then staggered a few steps and slowly sat down with her back against an ancient tree. The spear in her hand fell to the side. Huff, huff, the light panting sounded again. She looked up and slowly adjusted her breathing. The moonlight was cool like water, but it could not beat the endless night. However, the dense branches could still cast some spots of moonlight, illuminating this person's upturned face. Her hair was disheveled, and traces of sweat and blood could be faintly seen. Although her appearance was rather disheveled, it was difficult to conceal her unique and resolute temperament. It was undoubtedly Xiaowean. After a while, Sylvia raised the back of her hand and slowly wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth. She looked down at the dozens of wounds of various sizes under the broken god's blessing armor and could not help but be slightly stunned. How long had it been since she was in such a sorry state? It seemed to have been a long time. The last time he was in such a sorry state was probably 5 or 6 years ago. That time, he seemed to have encountered a dozen evil cult masters on a narrow path. In the end, he managed to kill a few of them and escaped with heavy injuries. Then, he turned around and fought back in order to stall the enemy until his companions arrived. He couldn't remember clearly. However, when he was young, he was often injured in the knight's training hall. In the end, all the healers recognized him. Hee. Sylvia couldn't help but smile when she thought of the interesting things that had happened in her childhood. At that time, his talent was outstanding, and he had a natural affinity with the divine fighting aura. Therefore, he was known as the martial arts genius of the Temple of Light. Now that he thought about it, with such glory, it was no wonder that none of his friends in the training hall were willing to team up with him. Every time they fought, they would team up against him. Although he could win every time, he would end up with injuries all over his body. Unfortunately, at that time, his personality was abnormally stubborn. When he saw that no one was willing to interact with him, he was even more unwilling to take the initiative to interact with others. In the end, he continuously practiced his spear techniques in a secluded area. Occasionally, when people saw him, they would praise him. However, when it reached the ears of his friends, they would dislike him. Phew. He took a deep breath and then slowly exhaled. Sylvia shook his head, dispelling the increasingly divergent thoughts in his mind. A bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Hee, it seems that I'm really dead this time. I'm always thinking about nonsense. Focusing, Sylvia's gaze became firm again. He began to consider his current situation. First of all, his divine fighting aura was almost exhausted. He couldn't even release his spear aura. There was basically no need to consider the possibility of breaking out of the encirclement and surviving. Moreover, there were too many barbarians. It was impossible to kill them all. If this continued, he would at most be able to hold on for another 2 hours. He probably wouldn't be able to see the sun rise tomorrow. No, the situation seemed to have changed. Half an hour should be enough. Thinking of this, Sylvia couldn't help but slightly shake his head. About 2 hours ago, The barbarian team that had been in a state of chaos had suddenly become very organized. Unknowingly, Sylvia realized that the space for her to escape was constantly shrinking. No matter where she escaped, she would meet the barbarians. For example, if she had temporarily escaped before, Sylvia could have rested for at least 10 minutes. But now, in less than 5 minutes, the barbarian team would come to search for her, forcing her to break out of the encirclement again. This situation of being surrounded by enemies made Sylvia have the illusion that there was a pair of invisible hands around her. Moreover, it was constantly driving her towards a dead end. She couldn't resist. Tightening her grip on the spear, Sylvia understood that there was an expert commander in the barbarian team. Unfortunately, she wasn't good at hiding. Hiding? I don't know if that guy is dead or not, obviously, Sylvia thought of Tangen. After breaking out of the barbarian encirclement in the afternoon, Sylvia couldn't even take care of herself. Naturally, she couldn't chase after Tangen. So, until now, she hadn't even seen Tangen's figure. He shouldn't be dead. He's good at hiding, and his speed is extremely fast. Plus, he has a cunning personality. Well, I haven't died yet. Naturally, he won't die either. Deducing this point, Sylvia's expression couldn't help but be a little depressed. Chasing after him for more than half a month and thousands of miles, she still couldn't kill him with her own hand. In the end, it was very likely that she would die earlier than him. This was really shameful. Sighing, she shook her head. Forget it. According to the current situation, even if he immediately rises to void level, he won't be able to escape. In the end, he will die here. This way it's fine. A mess of thoughts floated through her mind. Sylvia had rested for about 5 minutes. Knowing that the pursuers would arrive at any time, she didn't dare to delay. Grabbing the spear, she slowly stood up with the help of the tree trunk. She didn't immediately choose to leave this place. Instead, she reached out and stroked the flamed spear, muttering to herself, "Accompanying me for more than 10 years, never leaving me. Today, send me off for the last time." Of course, this wasn't an immediate suicide. Sylvia's character was persevering. As long as she still had a breath, she wouldn't have any compromise, give up, or other negative emotions. It was just that women in the battlefield had many natural disadvantages. Not to mention, she was the flower of the Temple of Light. In order to not suffer any possible humiliation, it was natural for her to use her weapon to commit suicide at the last moment. She walked a few steps to the largest moonlight spot beside her. Lowering her head and closing her eyes, she reached out and touched her forehead, shoulders and other places a few times. Finally, she crossed her fingers and cupped them in front of her chest. This was the unique prayer gesture of the Temple of Light. After thousands of smooth movements, there was a different kind of beauty to it. The moonlight was blue and clear. It was dim but not dark. The dense forest was quiet and silent. It was quiet but not dead quiet. Sylvia, who was in the prayer position, looked extremely pious. There was an indescribable harmony and holiness. At this moment, suddenly, her ears twitched. She opened her eyes and turned her head. Outside the dense forest, there was the sound of chaotic footsteps. Here it comes. Taking a deep breath, Sylvia grabbed the spear and ran to the left. But after running a few steps, her body suddenly stopped. In front of her, about a few dozen meters away, a blood-red figure was also running silently like the wind. When Sylvia stopped, the person also stopped. He turned his head and looked at her. Yes, you." Sylvia really didn't expect to meet Tangen at this time. After being stunned for a moment, her killing intent immediately exploded. On the other side, Tangen seemed to have just met Sylvia. He looked her up and down with a strange gaze. The corner of his mouth suddenly rose, revealing an evil smile. "Hee, good evening, beautiful." And the familiar tone, the familiar the title, it should be Tangen without a doubt. But Sylvia now looked at Tangen with a strange feeling. She couldn't tell what was strange about it. She just felt that the other party seemed to be a little more evil. The situation suddenly became a bit deadlocked. Tang En didn't make any moves. He was still looking Sylvia up and down. His mouth made a clicking sound from time to time. This was undoubtedly a bit frivolous. If it was a normal situation, Sylvia would have already shot him with her spear. But she didn't immediately respond because she suddenly realized a problem. Her fighting aura was almost exhausted and her fighting power was greatly reduced. But this guy in front of her looked relaxed. It was obvious that he was at ease. How should she fight? Of course, Sylvia was Sylvia after all. She had such an opportunity before her death. Even if the success rate was only 1 in 1,000, she wouldn't give it up. She was stunned for a moment. Then, she immediately brandished her spear and attacked. But at this time, whoosh, hundreds of barbarians appeared between the two amidst the chaotic sound of footsteps. They saw Sylvia in front of them. Before they could shout excitedly, they suddenly saw Tang En on the other side. Looking at his signature blood-red clothes, the barbarians couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. They were stunned on the spot. Chapter 597. If there was such a thing as fate, then he must be an expert at playing pranks. Although they were in the same valley, Sylvia did not expect to meet Tang En at this time. This feeling was just like how the barbarians did not expect to meet the crazy Bran here. It was unexpected, but also reasonable. After a few seconds of stalemate, Tang En tilted his head and looked at the frightened barbarians. Then, his evil eyes fell on the expressionless Sylvia. He nodded thoughtfully and asked, "Sylvia?" Xia Weian frowned in surprise. Of course, Tang En had long known about her identity, but what was with the questioning tone of waiting for confirmation? Oh, it must be. Tang En rubbed his temples with a relaxed expression. He also kept reminding me here. Well, he seems to have a problem with you? Him? Me? Sylvia did not reply. She just frowned even more and was puzzled. Could it be that the person in front of her was not Tang En? That was impossible. After so many days of chasing, Sylvia was naturally familiar with Tang En. Logically speaking, she should not have any doubts. But the Tang En in front of her gave her a strange feeling. They had the same facial features and the same ordinary appearance. Tang En looked very ordinary on the surface, and was not eye-catching at all. But now, with just a few subtle expressions and actions, Tang En gave people a feeling of unruliness, evil, and awe-inspiring. Such a completely different temperament naturally caused Xia Weian to be unable to help but be puzzled. "My hands are itchy. Tsk, look at this." Tang En spread his hands and a bloody dagger appeared in an instant. It spun rapidly between his fingers like a phantom. His expression was somewhat helpless and somewhat playful, but he's the owner of this body. I'm just a temporary worker, so of course I have to give him some face. Don't you think so, beautiful? Sylvia was slightly startled when she heard this. Then, her body suddenly tensed up. Although she could not confirm what was going on with Twain, she could not be wrong about the killing intent that suddenly swept over her. And it's not just him. I think you're not very happy either. Slightly raising his head, Tang En narrowed his long and narrow eyes. His smile suddenly disappeared and his tone was cold. Do you know? People like you only need to look at you to think of bigotry, stubbornness, holiness, hypocrisy, and so on. You're like the cream on a cake. It's obviously rotten inside, but you're still decent and bright. It really makes people like me, who are born evil, have a strong sense of destruction. Am I right? Let me think. He tapped his forehead with his finger and frowned slightly, as if he was recalling the memories in his mind. Flower of Nights? Well, that's true. There's more. Oh, as expected, the Temple of Light? Just from the name, it doesn't sound like anything good. The 100 or so barbarians in the northern wilderness, who were sandwiched in the middle, suddenly became a little restless. They looked excited and wanted to applaud. What he said made a lot of sense. Enough. With a roar, Sylvia, who had been baptized by the teachings of the Temple of Light since she was young, was naturally furious. Her face instantly became gloomy, and she did not hesitate to raise her flaming spear. An evil heretic like you has long fallen into the endless abyss. Only receiving the purification of the holy light is your best destination. Die. After she finished speaking, she did not care about the difference in strength between the two sides and rushed forward. Wow, what a loathsome and righteous sentence. Now Sylvia could no longer throw out her domineering spear, and could only choose to attack quickly. However, Tang En acted as if he did not see it and continued to speak with a disgusted expression. I can't stand your arrogant attitude the most. Moreover, it's King sincere. This is even more infuriating. Pausing for a moment, he took a step to the side, and the blood ray dagger accurately touched the body of the spear. Taking advantage of the momentum, Twain's ordinary face instantly became extremely sinister. Then today, let me peel off this layer of your holy disguise. After landing, he stepped forward quickly and his figure flashed to Sylvia's side. But at this moment, whoosh, the long spear was pulled back with a whistling sound, and was thrown horizontally. Although Xia Weian didn't have any dou qi left, she hadn't lost her spear art. Dozens of barbarians wouldn't be able to get close to her. Ha! With a long laugh, Tang En did not have the slightest intention to dodge. He directly waved the blood ray dagger and shook off the flaming spear. His figure moved forward again until he was near Sylvia. At this point, Sylvia's spear could not be used at all. The distance advantage was instantly gone. Correspondingly, Tang En's dagger launched a variety of small-scale ghostly attacks, forcing Xia Weian to continuously retreat. She was in a precarious situation. In just a moment, the battle showed a one-sided crushing situation. This was naturally abnormal. Even if Tang En activated the evil body skill and his fighting strength directly soared, it was absolutely not to the extent that he could suppress Sylvia in one move. The current abnormal situation was naturally because of the ceiling of the valley. Without fighting energy, even if Sylvia was born with great strength, she naturally could not resist Tang En's blood energy. Not good. Sylvia secretly complained as soon as they exchanged blows. She knew that the situation was not good. The other side waved the blood ray dagger casually, obviously with ease. If this went on, she would either be killed or captured. If she was killed, Sylvia could accept it and directly return to the embrace of the light god. But if she was captured, looking at Tang En's current demonic appearance, the result was really hard to say. It seemed that it was time to go back. Sighing secretly, Sylvia pursed her lips. Her eyes suddenly became extremely calm, but her attack movements became even faster. With a low roar, the flaming spear shook in an instant. The blazing fighting aura wantonly surged, and the familiar domineering spear appeared again, directly sweeping towards Tang En's waist. Huh! With a sound of surprise, Tang En subconsciously retreated half a step. Then his eyebrows suddenly rose, and his face slightly changed. He did not avoid the domineering spear, but forcibly rushed towards Sylvia. And at this moment, Chi! Looking up, the flaming spear condensed with Sylvia's last bit of holy fighting aura suddenly turned around, and in the blazing flames, the spear tip pierced towards his own heart. Sylvia actually wanted to kill herself with the spear. The martial arts genius of the Temple of Light, the Flower of Nights, Sylvia, killed herself with a spear. It was believed that if this news was passed back to the Bran, it would definitely be regarded as the biggest joke of the year. Who was Sylvia? Even if she did not have so many honors, from the royal family of the Bran to the poor commoners, who did not know this name that symbolized the holy light, the heroic beauty, and the name that made all evils retreat? But now the bloody fact was indeed in front of them. This Bran man, whether noble or commoner, was incomparably revered and admired Sylvia. This Bran woman who made countless Bran women crazy with jealousy, and could not wait to crush the eyebrow pencil in their hands, but on the surface, they had to pretend to applaud and praise Sylvia. However, on the surface, she actually turned the spear around and decisively killed herself. Everything had happened too suddenly. Anyone would have been able to recover from their shock at the first moment, let alone try to stop it. And one had to admit that even if a master committed suicide, it was not something that ordinary people could stop. At this moment, hit, like a thunderclap, a bloody figure instantly disappeared into the flames and disappeared in the blink of an eye. In the next moment, ding, the crisp sound of metal colliding was heard, and the bloody figure accurately hit the cold spear tip, and a spark bloomed. Pause for a while, the pitted dagger flashed and then bounced away. The body of the flaming spear suddenly slanted and flew out horizontally. Whoosh! Thud! It nailed itself into the trunk of an ancient tree not far away. The blazing flames instantly ignited the branches, and the boundless darkness rapidly retreated. The scene was silent. Sylvia stood there in a daze. There was no hole in her heart, but her left rib was broken, and there was a burn mark on the god's blessing armor. It was not even a small injury. However, because of the sudden death, even someone as calm as Sylvia could not immediately recover. At this moment, suddenly, bang! Her delicate body trembled, and she seemed to subconsciously want to dodge, but the attack had already arrived. Her body went soft and she fell straight to the ground. She did not fall to the ground, because the bloody figure behind her took a step diagonally, caught the falling dagger with one hand, and directly carried her up with the other. He laughed evilly and said, "Hee, the flower of the knights, the flower of the knights, want to die before I take off your holy disguise? It's not that easy. Ha ha." As soon as he finished speaking, he laughed and disappeared into the dense forest in a flash. After a while, when the hundreds of barbarians who had not moved from the beginning to the end came back to their senses, there was nothing in front of them except for the burning ancient tree. "Captain, are we still going to chase?" "Nonsense, of course we have to chase. Did you guys hear the last sentence that lunatic said?" What? He said to peel off something like skin, gulp. Let's go back and search. Right, take that spear, and say that it is the spoils of war left behind after the battle. Captain is wise. Chapter 598. At the top of the hill, bonfires were everywhere. As the place where the mysterious person personally oversaw, the defense work here naturally could not be careless. If someone could observe closely, they would realize that the so-called sentries every 3 steps and sentries every 5 steps was definitely not just an exaggeration. Moreover, this was similar to the main general personally coming here. It was not just for show or to stabilize the morale of the troops. In fact, since the start of the plan 2 hours ago, real-time information had been continuously sent to this place. Following that, the corresponding orders were sent out one after another. From this point of view, the young commander should have his considerations for choosing this place as the place to oversee. Although there was no precise measurement, this hill should be the center of this forbidden valley. Thus, the intention to control the entire situation was obvious. At this moment, did not find. Have you searched this place? Also did not find. Haha, interesting, it runs quite fast. The conversation came from one side of the hill. The young commander was asking a few barbarians in front of him in detail. He laughed and shook his head, looking relaxed. Not far away, she and I had gotten a cup of hot tea from somewhere and was walking over. Seeing this situation, she could not help but stop. First, she waited outside for a while, but after a few minutes, seeing that the conversation had not ended, she pursed her lips and called out softly, "Commander." In this case, no matter. "Oh, she and I wait first." Looking up and seeing she and I waiting at the side, the young commander smiled apologetically. Then, he gestured and ordered one by one, No matter what, the position of your tribe cannot be moved. As for you guys, search again and again. If there is no result this time. The young commander was very meticulous. The contents of the young commander's orders covered all aspects and were very detailed. Sometimes, he would unconsciously mention a few tactical terms, probably because he was worried that the barbarians who kept nodding their heads could not understand, so he changed it into common language. In the end, after the barbarians had completely repeated it, he nodded his head in satisfaction and waved his hand to let them leave. Everything was in order. The young commander pinched the bridge of his nose, dispelling the tiredness between his brows. Then, he opened his eyes and smiled. First, he pinched Shini's little face, then took the cup of tea. "Oh, thank you, Shini." Shini pouted her lips and said unhappily, "The tea is not hot." "Haha, it's fine. Warm is the best. I'm just thirsty." The young commander chuckled a few times. He pulled down the fur covering his face, picked up the teacup, and drank the tea. "Leader, of course you're thirsty after talking so much. Now your voice is a little hoarse. These soldiers are really stupid. Each one of them is more stupid than the other. They even need the commander to explain." Waving his hand, the young captain put down the teacup that he had finished drinking. "TSK. All right. My voice is hoarse because I was born hoarse. Don't you think it sounds good? Haha." Pause for a while, he shook his head slightly. "I'm indeed a little tired, but there's nothing I can do about it." Well, although some words sounded harsh, it was an indisputable fact that the tribesmen were not as smart as the Bran. Therefore, when I need to convey the message, the command must be simple, crude, and repetitive. This is what an Shui teacher taught me in the past. Sigh. Perhaps because he thought of Angro's death, the young commander paused and sighed. He could not help but look a little sad. Seeing this, Shini naturally understood. Blinking her eyes, she changed the topic and said, "Oh right, I heard Captain asking about those few people just now. Didn't go well? The 2 Bran men haven't been caught yet?" Nodding, "It's not going well. That woman from the Temple of Light is almost done. She should be done in about half an hour. But this crazy Bran man, is a little tricky." Shini was just casually mentioning it. Now that she heard this, she was shocked. Could it be that even Captain can't do it personally? "Haha, I don't have much strength. Of course I can't do it." Laughing, the young commander narrowed his eyes and said seriously, "This person is not simple. I don't know if he's a tactical master or if he was born with a pair of eyes that seek advantages and avoid disadvantages. I set up many cages and traps for him, but every time at the most crucial moment, he would always be able to jump out first and escape from our control. Just now, he suddenly disappeared. Our people can't find him." "There's such a thing?" Shini was even more shocked when she heard this. She was naturally clear about her regiment commander's capabilities. If she had to choose between an Shui and her regiment commander to follow, she would definitely choose her regiment commander without hesitation. Although there was a lot of emotion involved in this choice, there was no doubt that she had a lot of faith in the commander's ability to command. But now, the commander that she firmly believed in was still unable to trap the opponent. For a moment, Shini couldn't help but feel some respect for this crazy Bran man who had scared her before. "Then what do we do now? Are we just going to waste time like this?" "Haha, of course that's impossible." The young commander smiled and shook his head. "Although this Bran man is strong, as long as his strength isn't at the level where he can fight against 10,000 warriors, and in this sealed valley, he will be caught sooner or later. The only difference is how long it will take. But I don't have much time now. It depends on when he takes the initiative to take that step." Pause for a while, his eyebrows raised. "I also have the thought of changing my mind. If we capture him, I will give him a chance to surrender and live." Shini was stunned. "But he's a Bran man. He won't surrender, right? As long as he's willing, The brand men aren't a problem. It's not like there aren't any brand men in our tribe who have surrendered. And since he's being chased by people from the Temple of Light, he most likely won't be able to stay in the brand. Coming to our tribe isn't a bad choice. The young commander admired this crazy brand quite a bit, and his words had the intention of recruiting him. Of course, it's still too early to say this. We have to capture him first. Amidst the confusion, the young commander and Sheeny turned their heads to the east at almost the same time. There, Andre was talking loudly with an ordinary soldier who had come to report something. His arms were waving, and he seemed to be a little excited. What kind of joke is this? I've been to the brand before. Since when did the brand people become so king crazy? Hearing the faint words, the young commander and Sheeny looked at each other, and for a moment they were a little confused. Fortunately, at this moment, Andre was already scratching his head with one hand and holding a spear with the other. He looked a little conflicted as he walked over. What's wrong, brother Andre? This spear isn't bad. Is it that Temple of Light woman's? Yes, Commander. Waving the silver spear, Andre handed it over, and then nodded to Sheeny. Then he scratched his head and said, There's news. That crazy Bran has already crossed the encirclement line we set for him, and met that Temple of Light woman. Oh, no wonder we couldn't find him just now. Taking the silver spear, the young commander nodded in realization, and then said with interest, And then? Did they fight? There was a fight. At the time, there was a small tribe team present. But in just a few minutes, that crazy Bran knocked out the Temple of Light woman, picked her up, and ran away. Before he left a message. Pausing, Andre looked at Sheeny on the side, and his expression was a little hesitant. Seeing this, the young commander's expression suddenly changed, as if he understood something. But that Sheeny didn't see this strange look. Hearing the news of the Bran expert, who she admired a moment ago, she immediately urged, What message? Brother Andre, don't keep us in suspense, hurry up and say it. This is what you said. Muttering in a small voice, Andre pinched his nose and said, Hey, this Bran is crazy. Before, he sucked human blood in front of everyone, and there are rumors that he chewed up fingers. Interrupted by the exclamation, Sheeny frowned. Brother Andre, why did you suddenly mention this? It's disgusting. Skin. He said to skin that Temple of Light woman. Repeating his explanation, Andre shrugged at the stunned Sheeny, and said helplessly, Actually, just now was to set the stage. Ugh, Sheeny, with a little chaos, Sheeny, who had vomited to the point of exhaustion, barely managed to rinse her mouth a few times before being carried to a tent on the hill to rest. The sealed extreme valley didn't have any raging cold wind. Even if she buried the vomit in time, the smell wouldn't disperse in a short time. Obviously, she couldn't stay in this area. Walking to the other side of the mountain, after chatting for a while, the young commander suddenly said, Andre, when that crazy Bran appears again, you will lead the merchant group to track him. You only need to track him from afar. Leave the fighting to the other tribes. You must be careful. Ugh, how can that be? Hearing this, Andre was shocked and immediately rejected. Our mission is to protect the commander's safety. That crazy Bran is very strong. If we take the opportunity to sneak attack. Waving his hand to interrupt, the young commander chuckled, Haha, it's fine, let me finish first. The night sky was low, and on the bright and quiet hill, there were whispers mixed with the crackling of the bonfire. For a moment it was hard to hear everything, but vaguely, there was a hint of a conspiracy. Chapter 599. The bonfire was burning fiercely, reflecting the current situation of the stone platform on one side of the mountain wall. The figures were entangled, undulating up and down. Rampant evil laughter, fragmentary words. Tang En naturally would not let go of such a great opportunity to humiliate her. If Sylvia was still rational at this time, she would definitely be able to detect the abnormality from these seemingly humiliating words. The words Temple of Light, God, and so on had appeared too many times. However, with Sylvia's current situation, of course, she would not notice these words. She would only think of these words when she was alone in the future, or when she was dreaming in the middle of the night, and then resentment would arise in her heart. The first target of her resentment would naturally be Tang En, but if she could not kill Tang En as soon as possible in a short period of time, then, in the constant echoes of words in her head, the target of her resentment would turn to the God she believed in. Perhaps it was not resentment, but a trace of doubt. But as long as the seed was produced, Tang En's goal would be achieved. Because these traces of doubt would eventually take root and sprout on their own in the continuous memory, and grow strong and healthy. Mortals were mortals after all. As long as there were emotions and desires, these emotions were inevitable. For example, a civilian walking on the street was innocently beaten, but when he complained to the police station, there was no effect, or it could be said that it was not taken seriously, and the effect was not satisfactory. Then, this person would of course hate the person who beat him, but at the same time, he would also go to the police station with hatred. Of course, the resentment of a civilian would not produce any big result. After getting drunk and cursing a few words, the resentment would almost dissipate. But Sylvia was different. From her memory until now, her belief in the God of Light was undoubtedly pure, and it was not an exaggeration to say that she was a fanatical believer. If such a person were to be shaken, it would definitely be like a flood that was unstoppable. The so-called saying that there was only a fine line between love and hate was the same principle. And Sylvia's character was very serious. So, one could imagine how tormenting and painful she would be at that time, so, in a sense, the scene in front of him that seemed to be unusually erotic was actually a game of psychology and faith. It was also a revenge, a cruel and thorough revenge. The chase on the stone platform was still going on, but the current situation was very different from a few days ago. Now, Tang En had the absolute initiative, and was looking for an opening to attack with an extremely relaxed expression. On the other hand, Sylvia was dodging passively. She was terrified. Men and women had fought throughout history, and from the statistical probability, it would usually start with the man winning, and this time was no exception. Oh, by the way, the final winner of this battle is usually the woman. Actually, I know what you're thinking. Haha. You must think that I'm slandering the God of Light and that I'm just spouting nonsense. Well, that's normal. After all, you've been a believer for so many years and have learned how to deceive yourself. Don't be so quick to deny it. Oh, you can't speak now. Don't worry, if you have the heart, you can try to investigate the so-called miracle. Investigate the story behind this and see if it's really that godly? Marketing, I understand. It's nothing more than some tricks to confuse the public and fool the civilians. The words suddenly stopped, and Tang En and Sylvia's body shook at the same time. The cave fell into silence, and only the crackling of the bonfire could be heard. Blinking, Tang En looked at Sylvia's eyes that were full of pain, confusion, shock, and other complicated feelings. Feeling the warm and soft jade wrapped below, Tang En subconsciously licked his lips. Tsk. I was careless, ah. With a painful cry, Sylvia closed her eyes. Yes, just now, she was officially violated by the disgusting guy on top of her. Logically speaking, it shouldn't be so fast. Sylvia had been resisting, and Tang En didn't have a chance to get up and aim. It looked like pure luck. But in fact, this was inevitable. After all, the naive Sylvia had no experience in this area. Many of her struggling and dodging movements were superfluous. But Tang En was different. Although he hadn't done it in a different world, he wasn't a virgin. In the modern world, he had a girlfriend and accumulated a lot of combat experience. And Tang En, in the state of the evil body, naturally inherited this experience. It was only natural for such a situation to occur now. No one knew Sylvia's complicated feelings now, or perhaps, even she herself didn't know. But she was Sylvia. She was one of the 12 holy knight commanders of the Temple of Light, the overbearing Sylvia with peerless strength. She was Sylvia, whom many experts of the savage cult hated, but who had no choice but to retreat when they heard the news. She was Sylvia, whom countless young men in the brand dreamed of, but when they really got close to her, they would only think of blasphemy. But now, this beautiful woman's body was taken in this shabby cave, and it was an out-and-out rape. Since the city gate had been broken, Tang En naturally had no reason to immediately withdraw his troops. Without hesitation, the humiliation continued, and his instincts began to drive his body's movements. Sylvia opened her eyes in an instant, and her breathing became rough. Of course, this wasn't because her body felt something, but because it was completely caused by the pain. The fierce resistance was staged again. Sylvia tightly pursed her lips and didn't make any more sound. At the same time, her body trembled constantly, like a fish out of water, fighting for its life. This kind of resistance was naturally not meaningless. As mentioned before, as long as a woman didn't compromise and resisted desperately, it was difficult for the perpetrator to succeed. And although Tang En was doing the hard work now, he didn't want to forcibly break Sylvia's hands and feet and completely control her, because the humiliation would be greatly reduced. So basically, it was also intermittent, and there wasn't any continuous pleasure. At this time, most of the dead branches and rotten leaves in the bonfire had been burned, and the fire was gradually dying down. So the area of the shadow reflected on the mountain wall was somewhat reduced. Basically, only Tang En's figure could be seen. In the surging flames, the shadow was elongated and twisted, like an abyss demon. Finally, about a few minutes later, Tang En took the lead to stop, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he stopped in the depths, looked at Sylvia's face, and said with an evil smile, "Do you know when a man will stop in this kind of situation?" Sylvia, whose chin was dislocated, naturally couldn't answer. But even if she could speak normally, Sylvia, who had never come into contact with this field, couldn't give a clear answer. It seemed that he also knew this situation. Giving birth to a child. Sylvia's face suddenly became extremely flustered, and her whole mind was blank. If that really happened, she would rather die now. What are you thinking? Tang En's expression suddenly became extremely disgusted. His right hand patted Sylvia's face a few times, and then he lifted her chin and humiliated her from left to right, and said with extreme disdain, "The flower of the night, the flower of the night. Oh, it's nothing more than this. Ordinary goods, even less interesting than those street nightingales. If it weren't for you being so annoying, do you think I would do something to you?" Tch. Mocking with disdain, Tang En let go of Sylvia's wrist that was clamping down. His hand supported his body, and his body suddenly lifted up. Pop! A strange sound was heard, and the two figures separated. Sylvia was completely stunned, and she didn't even cover her shameful part at first. Although she really had no experience in this area, she also knew that a man should never stop at this time. At the same time, Tang En's extremely disdainful and mocking words began to echo in her mind. No matter what, Sylvia was also a woman. Although she had never cared much about her appearance and figure, since she became an adult, from the admiring gazes that were cast at her, she roughly knew that she should be considered beautiful. But now the scene in front of her, and the disgusting words of that disgusting guy, constantly pierced her self-esteem like a sharp sword. "I'm not even as good as a street nightingale." A different kind of emotion quickly accumulated and rose in her chest. At this time, Tang En had already floated down from the stone platform. As he pulled his belt, he looked at Sylvia, who was completely naked except for the calf armor. His eyes flashed, and then he disdainfully curled his lips. "Put on your clothes. Although there's nothing to look at least it's not so cheap that it's disgusting." Of course, this was not the truth. Whether it was in terms of appearance, figure, or the sense of conquest that came with her special identity, Sylvia was undoubtedly extremely outstanding. But the evil body Tang En had already made a plan in his heart. Now, it was natural that he would greatly humiliate and despise her. This was his final trump card. Such a great humiliation that would hurt both her body and mind would definitely follow Sylvia closely for the rest of her life. It would be impossible for her to forget it even if she wanted to. And only in this way would the seed of darkness be sure to penetrate into Sylvia's heart. In fact, no one knew the future effect, but the effect at the moment was immediately visible. Wah! Suddenly there was a cry. Since she could remember, no matter how unbearable the pain she suffered, no matter how difficult the situation was, Sylvia had never made a sound. But now she was actually crying. Tears flowed from the corners of her eyes uncontrollably. She curled up her body and hugged her knees, like a homeless bird in the wind and rain, hissing and trembling, ===. Chapter 600. The dim light of the night shrouded the wilderness. It was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. It was close to dawn. Halfway up the mountain, there was a slight tremor. A millstone boulder was moved from somewhere else. It fell down and blocked the entrance of the hidden cave. Then, in the darkness of the night, specks of blood flashed. A figure stood in front of the huge rock, waving his arms as if he was resting. Rustling sounds could be heard as rocks fell one after another. Only when a faint yellow light shone through the cave did he stop. Needless to say, this person was Tang En. Tang En in the state of the evil body. Just as he had planned before, since he was unwilling to simply kill Xia Weian here, he would naturally leave quickly after humiliating her. After all, although this cave was hidden, more than 10,000 barbarians weren't incompetent. They could hide for a while, but they couldn't hide from a large-scale search. Of course, in order for this plan to be carried out smoothly, and for Xia Weian to constantly be tormented by the wavering of her faith, Tang En naturally could not let her die in the hands of the barbarians. Therefore, Tang En immediately moved a boulder to block the entrance after knocking Sylvia unconscious. He also made a meticulous camouflage on the outside to ensure that the barbarians wouldn't find this place in a short time. After cleaning up the traces and finally covering the dozens of vines on the outside, Tang En took 2 steps back and looked around. Then, he nodded and said, "It's done." Tang En's camouflage skill was top-notch. The hidden cave in front of him had become a natural part of the mountain. It was as if it had never appeared. There was no flaw. Not to mention observing from the outside, even Sylvia would have to spend a lot of effort to come out. Of course, Sylvia had been knocked unconscious. Moreover, Tang En had hit her hard. It was estimated that she wouldn't wake up for a few hours. At that time, without the aid of any fighting energy or tools, it would take at least half a day for Xia Weian to use brute force to move the boulder blocking the door and escape. Tang En did not doubt Xia Weian's perseverance at all. However, by the time she came out, she was afraid that the sealed valley would be empty. After going through the plan from start to finish, he didn't miss anything. Tang En nodded slightly, and then suddenly smacked his lips. TSK, although your life is saved, how are you going to escape when the time comes? Were they going to run around naked in the mountains? Oh, just thinking about it makes me look forward to it. Amidst the evil laughter, Tang En's figure flashed and instantly disappeared on the spot. The boulder was silent and the vines withered. Who would have thought that the famous flower of the Knights of the Temple of Light would suffer a nightmarish humiliation in this shabby cave? Her virginity was forcibly taken and she was knocked unconscious here, and this person even despised her and gave up halfway. Such a disgrace! Even blood wouldn't be enough to wash it off. The scene in the cave didn't take long, at most half an hour or so. The tens of thousands of barbarians were still searching like a net. Sparks flew everywhere, showing no signs of giving up. Not long after Tang En left the cave. Beep, alarms and roars rose and fell one after another, ringing out one after another. It was undeniable that under the arrangement of the young leader, the barbarians' search team followed one wave after another. It seemed very organized. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the sealed valley was no different from a dangerous place. Even if Tang En was extremely fast and had top-notch concealment skills, he would inevitably be discovered. Of course, discovery was one thing, encirclement was another. As long as Tang En wasn't unlucky enough to fall into the trap set by the barbarians in advance, then the barbarians wouldn't be able to form a large-scale encirclement around him in a short time. Tang En was now moving in the direction of the east. That was the nearest exit of the valley. As for whether he wanted to break out from there, well, Tang En didn't pay attention to logic when he was in the state of the evil body. No one knew what he was thinking, just like when he suddenly pushed Sylvia away when he was enjoying himself. Whoosh! Tang En didn't have the slightest intention of hiding. His figure was as fast as lightning as he went straight to the east exit of the valley. On the way, he bumped into several groups of barbarian soldiers, but before they could react, Tang En had already rushed past them. The area of the sealed valley wasn't small, but it wasn't big either. At such a speed, Tang En could see the east exit of the valley in about 10 minutes. He stopped and narrowed his eyes. This valley entrance was different from the spacious valley entrance he had entered from the south. It was extremely narrow, like a line in the sky. It was a typical terrain that was easy to defend but hard to attack. At this time, countless barbarians were standing around the narrow valley entrance, including the peaks on both sides. The night was blurry, so he couldn't see clearly, but there were at least 1,000 of them. Moreover, they must have heard the warning sounds from behind. They were already prepared and were ready to draw their bows and knock their arrows. After a moment of silent observation, Tang En shook his head slightly. He seemed to be helpless. Of course, if his previous plan was to break out from here, he would have been disappointed. The young commander had made such a big move and mobilized so many people. Naturally, he wouldn't make a mistake in this regard. Tang En turned around again and narrowed his eyes to look behind him. A dense group of barbarians was shuttling between the hills. They were constantly encircling him. Among them, there were a few figures that were exceptionally eye-catching. With a few simple movements, they easily crossed the gullies and hills in front of them. They were obviously experts. However, they seemed to be afraid of Tang En. They stopped at a distance of 1,000 meters and didn't approach him. The evil body of Tang En didn't make any special reaction to this. He acted as if he didn't see them and rushed out quickly. This time, he was heading towards the north. It seemed that he would only be satisfied after checking all the exits of the valley. The barbarians' encirclement hadn't formed yet. Naturally, they couldn't encircle Tang En. He spread out his speed and easily broke out of the encirclement. The barbarians behind him had a clear division of labor. Some of them stopped and returned to their own defensive areas. Some of them continued to pursue him, crossing various defensive areas. However, there was still a big gap between the speed of the ordinary barbarians and that of Tang En. In just a moment they were left far behind. At this time, the experts of the barbarians finally appeared. There were about 15 or 16 of them. They were the only ones who could barely keep up with Tang En's speed. They were closely following him at a distance of 1,000 meters. They ran like this for about 10 minutes. Suddenly, Tang En in front of them stopped abruptly and turned around. He rushed straight to the southwest. After a few breaths, the complexions of the more than 10 experts of the northern wilderness changed greatly. It turned out that Tang En had increased his speed by a large margin. In the blink of an eye, he had pulled a long distance away from them. His figure disappeared into the night. Speed up, speed up, speed up again. Whoosh! If Tang En's previous speed was as fast as lightning, then he had now turned into a swift and violent lightning. The trees, hills, and other things around him were constantly flashing past his line of sight as he rapidly retreated. The quiet and windless sealed steep valley was now accompanied by the whistling sound of the wind because of Tang En. There was no doubt that Tang En was now running at full speed. Moreover, his speed was even faster than before in the state of the evil body. It could be said that he was terrifying. In a short 3 minutes, Tang En seemed to have reached his destination when he turned and climbed up a low mound. His speed had slowed down. However, in this state, even Tang En himself seemed to be unable to control his powerful inertia. He once again rushed forward a few dozen meters and arrived at the top of the mound. Then, his eyes suddenly brightened. In front of him was a mountain peak that was neither too tall nor too short. Bonfires were everywhere, illuminating the surrounding 100 meters. Teams of barbarian soldiers holding iron rods were patrolling the surroundings. There were also many soldiers with bows and arrows at the back of the mountain peak. The defense was extremely tight. If a barbarian discovered Tang En at this time, he would certainly show a horrified and frightened expression, because this was the center of the sealed steep valley. And on the top of this mountain peak, the young commander with a special identity was commanding. At this point, the evil body of Tang En's thoughts and goals were obvious. Sylvia would leave the cave in about a day. At that time, she would have two choices. One was to continue to pursue Tang En, and the other was to return to the Bran. The former was naturally for revenge, washing away the shame and so on. The latter was her first subconscious reaction after her physical and mental injuries. It could be said that both choices were possible, and if Tang En was more than 100 miles away from the sealed steep valley, then Sylvia's choice would naturally lean towards the latter. After all, she didn't succeed in pursuing him at close range. Now that he was more than 100 miles away, there was no point in pursuing him. Therefore, Tang En had to break out of the sealed steep valley as soon as possible. This way, he could lead the barbarians away and prevent Sylvia from running into them again. Secondly, he could increase the distance between him and Sylvia. She would give up the idea of pursuing him and return to the Bran to wait for the seed of darkness to take root and germinate, but who would have thought that Tang En would choose to break out of the sealed steep valley by turning around and killing the barbarian commander? Chapter 601. On the mountain peak, the fire was still brightly lit, and the layers of defense laid by thousands of barbarians were still as tight as before. Although most of them didn't know the identity and status of the person on the mountain peak, from the respectful expression of their own tribe's chief, as well as the way he was ordered around, all of them clearly showed that the person on the mountain peak was a big shot with a prominent status. Therefore, the patrolling guards didn't dare to be negligent. Of course, Tang En didn't know about this, and he didn't care. For him, it was enough to know that the person on the mountain peak was the commander of this barbarian army. There were thousands of barbarians around the mountain peak, and the surrounding 100 meters was still an open space. Under such circumstances, Tang En naturally wouldn't seek death by force. After all, this wasn't the way to play. If he were to barge in like this, he would become an arrow pig. Perhaps this was the reason why there was a limit to a person's strength. No matter how strong a person was, or how good his skills were, he would always feel that his hands and feet were tied in front of a group of behemoths. He would only shake his head helplessly. Take Sylvia for example. Her strength was quite good, and she could definitely be considered as an expert. A few ordinary experts of the savage, evil cult could easily take her down. But under the pursuit of thousands of ordinary barbarians who could be pinched to death, she could only flee in all directions. She couldn't do anything about it. Fortunately, Tang En wasn't Sylvia. Although he didn't have her tyrannical strength, he still had a variety of tricks up his sleeve. If Sylvia wanted to enter this heavily guarded mountain peak, she would have to brace herself and barge in. But Tang En would never do that. As long as he was given some time to prepare, he would always find a way to sneak in without getting hurt. Well, in fact, Tang En had already entered, and he was swaggering in. Long black hair, simple animal skin, and a full beard. He looked exactly like a barbarian. But this was Tang En's current appearance. Oh, he also had another identity now. He was a barbarian scout who had come to report the situation. As for this identity, and who was the original owner of this outfit? Well, who cared? All they needed to know was that he had happily gone to another world after receiving his lunchbox. After entering the mountain peak, Tang En discovered that not only was there a strict defense around the mountain peak, but it was also the same inside. He could see barbarian soldiers standing guard everywhere. Logically speaking, this was somewhat abnormal. However, evil Tang En did not think too much about it. He just assumed that the enemy commander was too afraid of death. Since the commander was sitting in the center, there were many barbarians who came to report the latest news. Under such circumstances, Tang En didn't receive any strict inspection. He went all the way to the edge of the mountain peak without any hindrance. At this point, Tang En had no choice but to stop. There was a circle of barbarian guards around the peak of the mountain. So, one had to pass through a side passage if one wanted to enter the mountain normally. However, a middle-aged barbarian man was standing in the middle of the passage. He was holding a pen and paper in his hand. He looked like a cultured man. A few other barbarian soldiers had gathered around him. They had also come to report to him. They were gesticulating and talking to each other. Tang En went closer and observed for a while. He then realized that he had to tell this middle-aged barbarian some information if he wanted to see the commander. If the information was important, the middle-aged barbarian would go in and report to the commander. Then, the commander would decide whether to summon him for detailed questioning. This situation was normal. After all, there was too much information coming in from all directions. Many of them were repetitive and useless. If the commander had to question them one by one, he wouldn't be able to withstand it no matter how energetic he was. Tang En naturally didn't have any information. It wasn't that he forgot to interrogate the commander. It was just that he didn't understand the barbarian language. So, it was useless to ask. However, standing here, he could roughly see the entire mountain peak through the gaps in the barbarian guards. It was empty. He couldn't see anyone except for the stones. However, there was a gray tarpaulin tent in the center of the mountain peak. The tent was brightly lit. He could vaguely see the reflection of a few figures on the tarpaulin. At this moment, "Oh Callie!" a vague barbarian language sounded in his ears. Tang En turned his head and saw that the middle-aged barbarian had finished talking with the other barbarians. He was asking him something. After a few seconds of silence, Tang En turned his head again and looked at the tarpaulin tent. He narrowed his long and narrow eyes. It seemed that he was considering something. From the surface, the only tent in his line of sight was the commander's office. However, Tang En had spent a lot of effort to come here. But, he had a hesitant look on his face. He didn't see anything wrong with this place. But, he had a feeling that something was wrong here. Lao Li Nua. The middle-aged barbarian frowned and walked over with an impatient look on his face. He was mumbling something that sounded like he had a big tongue. Tang En let out a sigh of relief. Then, he turned around and went forward to greet the barbarian. No matter what the situation was, there was no reason to shrink back since he had already come here. Both sides were only a few steps away from each other. The middle-aged barbarian was still talking about something. However, the expressionless Tang En suddenly raised his hand and slapped the barbarian. The slap was so light that it didn't even make a sound. Bang! The middle-aged barbarian didn't have time to react. It was as if he had been hit by a galloping warhorse. He was sent flying in a whirl. The stack of papers in his left hand also scattered in a flash. Whoosh! Everything happened in a flash. Even the barbarian soldiers who were about to return didn't understand what had happened. They were still in a daze. They saw the barbarian's figure flash and appear in front of the barbarian soldiers from the white papers that were fluttering in the air. It was as if he had shrunk the ground and appeared in front of the barbarian soldiers. Blood-red light burst out. Bang, bang, bang. These guards were only here to maintain order. They didn't have any defensive function. After all, they wouldn't be able to stop someone who could break into this place. So, the symbolic meaning was far greater than the actual effect. Therefore, they couldn't stop Tang Yin's sudden attack. A few tall and sturdy figures flew up in the air amidst the screams. Tang Yin took advantage of this gap and quickly rushed towards the tarpaulin tent. It was only a few dozen meters away. Tang Yin didn't waste his time to look for the entrance of the tent. He waved his arm and a cold blade light flashed. The tarpaulin was torn apart. He rushed in. However, Tang Yin's body shook as soon as he stepped in. His expression changed. The barbarians who were standing or sitting in the tent didn't expect such a situation. They looked at this uninvited guest in a daze. Of course, this wasn't the main point. The main point was that these people were obviously ordinary barbarians. They didn't look like the young commander and the others. He had obviously fallen into their trap. Tang Yin turned his head and looked at the barbarians who were slowly coming up from the top of the mountain. The corners of his mouth curled into a mocking and evil smile. Well, it was a self-mocking smile this time. Oh, Fu *K. At this time, a few barbarians who were supposed to be on the left side of the mountain appeared on a small hill. Wow. You took the bait. Who asked you to do those disgusting things to scare me? Serves you right. Commander, we did it. Looking up at the human figures on the top of the mountain and hearing the deafening battle cries, she clenched her fist and waved it in the air. She cheered with a face full of joy. Not yet. After answering casually, the young commander's expression remained calm. He tilted his head and said to his entourage, "In 10 minutes, let the tribes that received the news in advance gather here and surround this mountain." Yes. This isn't a success? He can't escape even if he has wings now. She shook her head disapprovingly. Then she came over with a face full of admiration. That was close. Commander, how did you know this lunatic would come? It's simple, I guess. Commander. This perfunctory answer obviously couldn't satisfy Shini's curiosity. She whined coquettishly and shook the young commander's arm. All right. It seemed that he couldn't do anything about this. The young commander finally gave in and shook his head slightly. Actually, I guessed. And wait for me to finish. From the moment we entered this valley, the two Bulan elites only had 2 options to break out of the encirclement. One was to barge into the heavily guarded valley, and the other was to think of some cheap tricks, such as taking us as hostages, or killing us to create chaos and take the opportunity to escape. These 2 choices weren't good. Relatively speaking, the first one had a higher chance of success. The second one had a higher chance of being unharmed. If they had to choose, most rational people would choose the first one. Because although they might be heavily injured, they would still have a chance to escape. Unlike the second one, although it has a great temptation, there are too many unknown risks. If they aren't careful, they would be doomed eternally. She blinked and said, but he chose the second one. That's why I said he's crazy. Or maybe. Spreading out his hands, the young commander squinted his eyes and looked at the top of the mountain. He smiled. Haha, just like how I don't know how crazy he is. He definitely doesn't know how powerful I am. Chapter 602. Just like how I don't know how crazy he is, he definitely doesn't know how powerful I am. Pause for a while, laughed and shook his head. Haha, I feel like I'm boasting a bit. But the logic is more or less the same. Just like on the battlefield, if an ordinary general doesn't know that his opponent is in Shui or Z, he will deploy the battle step by step. But if he knows, then his response strategy is likely to change. Most of them only want to defend and wait for reinforcements, not daring to attack easily. With his hands tied and feet tied, He won't have much confidence in the battle strategy he previously set. Oh, the more you talk, the more you deviate. Rubbing his forehead, the young commander narrowed his eyes slightly. Zi and Shui are destined to leave a thick and colorful stroke in the annals of history. Their achievements will be remembered through the ages for future generations to admire and praise. Right now, I'm still far from that height, not worth mentioning. But, haha, with an unintentional scheme, it's not a big problem to capture someone who underestimates me. He pointed at the chaotic mountain peak where waves of battle cries came from. Unfortunately, this Master Bran underestimated me. Well, maybe not underestimated, but just didn't care. In these few days of pursuit, we were in the dark while he was in the light. He didn't know our situation at all, but we roughly knew all kinds of information about him. Like I said before, if he was a rational person, then 90% of them would choose to break out from the valley entrance. But he obviously isn't. Not to mention whether the blood-sucking and skinning were real or not. When he first met us, he still made a throat-slitting gesture at us when he was surrounded. This person is very dangerous, and it's easy to use unconventional methods. He can't be judged by common sense. Also, oh, he's back. After a pause, the young commander turned his head and saw more than a dozen figures in the distance running toward them. They were the Northern Wilderness Masters who were previously shaken off by Tang En. They were also members of a small merchant team. He continued, everyone knows that the general of an army must be heavily guarded. If he wants to succeed in capturing and killing, he must catch them off guard. This is also the reason why he went straight to the eastern entrance of the valley. He didn't want to break out from there. He just wanted to create a false impression to lower our vigilance. After that, when he saw Andre and the other experts that we had purposely sent out to chase after him, he naturally felt more at ease. He really was a decisive person. He immediately rushed over and even silently made his way to the peak of the mountain. Good move, good ability. The young regiment commander's words were indifferent. Occasionally, he would chuckle lightly with a look of admiration on his face. His expression was still calm. However, if the evil body Tang En was here, listening to his plan being slowly deduced and every move being completely dissected step by step, it would only be a pain in the ass, Commander. After saying this, Andre, who had just returned, walked over with an ugly expression on his face. Although this was a plan that they had set up beforehand, they were still left far behind by the enemy even when they were prepared. No one would be in a good mood. Seeing this, Sheeny, who already knew the inside story, naturally knew what was going on. She stuck out her tongue and changed the topic. Right, isn't there still a woman from the Temple of Light? Where is she? The young commander looked at Sheeny with a smile that wasn't a smile, then shook his head slightly. There's still no news. I'm afraid it's not good. At this moment, Sheeny was secretly glancing at Andre. She happened to meet the young commander's gaze that seemed to be able to see through her thoughts. She immediately felt a little guilty and subconsciously repeated her question. Not good. He nodded. That woman from the Temple of Light is very strong, but it can be seen that she's not good at hiding. So once she appeared, she would definitely be discovered by our people. But, hey, this madman in front of us had already appeared long ago, but she, who was kidnapped, didn't. What does this mean? Hearing this, Sheeny's delicate body suddenly trembled violently. She clearly swallowed her saliva, and with a frightened and hesitant expression, she said, no, she couldn't have really been skinned by the madman. In the end, because she was too scared, she couldn't bring herself to say the next word. Spreading out his hands, Tang En and Sylvia had just disappeared for about half an hour, and they hadn't been able to find them. This young commander naturally couldn't give any reasonable conjectures. But based on the situation of the two chasing over 1,000 miles to this place, the captured Sylvia's situation naturally wouldn't be too good. Thinking of this, Sheeny's mouth twitched, and she didn't ask any more questions. At this moment, the battle on the mountain peak was still ongoing, but the location had changed from the peak to the middle of the mountain, and it looked a little messy. Seeing this, Andre couldn't help but frown. It was very obvious that the ambush on the mountain peak wasn't able to trap the enemy. And now that they were at the middle of the mountain where there was more space to maneuver, it would undoubtedly be harder to kill the enemy. Of course, this was only a small worry. At this point, Andre didn't think that the enemy had the possibility of killing their way out of the mountain peak. And at this moment, the surrounding tribes had already rushed over, surrounding this place so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. No matter how one looked at it, this was definitely a dead end. But, The young commander was surprised, and his bright brows were also slightly wrinkled, as if he couldn't understand. Strange. From yesterday until now, such a long time has passed. His do-chi should have been exhausted. Maybe he didn't use it much before. His skills are very good. If we didn't have many warriors here, he could have easily dealt with us without using do-chi. Andre was also a warrior, and after thinking for a while, he immediately gave the most reasonable explanation. Then he curled his lips, but he should be an arrow at the end of its flight now, and can't hold on for long. 10 minutes, and at most 10 minutes. That was the logic. Since the enemy could do something like attacking the mountain peak, he definitely had some do-chi on him. But after fighting for so long, he definitely didn't have much do-chi left. Hearing this, the young commander's wrinkles didn't disappear, probably because she didn't completely agree with this explanation. But she didn't seem to know much about martial arts, so she didn't say anything. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Soon, under Andre's increasingly gloomy face, the fierce battle on the mountain peak had actually lasted for a full 15 minutes. And from the free-falling figures from the mountain peak, the enemy's fighting power was still tyrannical. Phew! That's not right. Taking a deep breath, the young commander frowned and shook his head, finally beginning to suspect, as long as this person's strength hasn't reached void level, his do-chi definitely can't last for so long. What's the problem? On the side, Sheenie didn't know martial arts, so naturally she couldn't answer. Andre's strength wasn't bad, but looking at the situation in front of him, he also scratched his head, completely unable to understand what was going on. Of course, no matter if it was Andre who was familiar with martial arts, or the young commander who was as intelligent as a demon, no matter how hard they thought, they would never think that this guy who was madly fighting in front of them wasn't relying on do-chi from another world, but the system's blood-chi that would automatically replenish itself every morning. It wasn't on the same level at all. How could they guess? And now it was only 4 or 5 in the morning. It could be said that as long as Tangen didn't die, then if they wanted to wait until his blood-chi ran out, they would really have to wait. Smart people usually wouldn't give up so easily, and this young commander was the same. From time to time, he would whisper to himself, guessing one possibility after another, which would be immediately denied, and then guess again. 10 minutes later, Andre was the first to give up, raised his head, and suddenly punched the air with his right fist. Whoosh! In the air-breaking sound, the black light on his arm suddenly exploded, wanton and enchanting, and then slowly dissipated in the air. After making this somewhat strange attack, Andre closed his eyes, as if he was experiencing something. A few seconds later, his eyes opened, and his hands held his head as he squatted down. His expression was a mess. There's no do-chi. How can this madman last for so long? It was very obvious that the attack just now was because Andre couldn't understand it after much thought, and whimsically changed the target of suspicion to the sealed valley, thinking that this special environment had suddenly malfunctioned. But the result of the experiment was obviously not the case. The sealed valley was still isolated from all the basic elements, and that madman Bran was still alive and killing. With a cry of surprise, Sheenie didn't bother to think about this problem. Of course, it was very likely that she was too lazy to think about it, So only she had been paying attention to the situation at the mountain peak. She pointed with her arm. "Look, he's about to rush out." Hearing this, the young commander and Andrei raised their heads in shock, only to discover that Madman Bran had actually broken through the blockade of more than 1,000 barbarians, and was about to kill his way to the foot of the mountain. And they didn't know what method he used, but those noisy barbarians at the mountainside obviously didn't notice this point, and were still looking around like headless flies, really clumsy. Fiercely pounding his palms, Andrei's face was ashen, and he said in a deep voice, "Commander, I'll bring some people to kill him now." Very obviously, Andrei still didn't believe that Tang En still had much dou qi on him, and wanted to use the 10 or so experts of the caravan to go in and launch the final attack. "No, brother Andrei." Sheeny was shocked, and hurriedly tried to stop him. This Madman Bran's strength was so terrifying, Sheeny naturally didn't want to see her sweetheart put himself in danger. "Stop!" With a low shout, the young commander waved his hand to stop her, and then frowned as he looked at the figure at the foot of the mountain that was moving freely, as if there was no one there, and muttered to himself for a few seconds, "Let's go, we'll go together." Sheeny was speechless. She couldn't even persuade one Andrei, and now she had to involve the whole team? But without waiting for her to object, the young commander had already walked forward and said calmly, "Since he can come down the mountain, then, what's wrong with giving him a chance to surrender?" Although the only meeting between the two sides wasn't very friendly, from the beginning to the end, the young commander admired Tang En very much, and always had the intention of recruiting him. Of course, this idea wasn't very strong until Tang En miraculously rushed to the foot of the mountain with his own strength. Finally, she made up her mind to give this Bran expert a chance to surrender. Now, there were about 5 tribes gathered around the mountain peak. The one on the mountain peak was originally here, and the other 4 were transferred here later, guarding the 4 directions of the mountain peak. It could be said that there was absolutely no chance of anything happening. As for the other tribes, they were still outside, looking for Sylvia's traces. Tang En's breakthrough to the foot of the mountain could be hidden from some of the barbarians on the mountain peak, but he definitely couldn't hide from the many eyes below. Just as the young commander and the others arrived here, Tang En was about to kill his way out from the southeast of the mountain peak, but was immediately forced back by a rain of arrows. At this moment, beep, beep, after a few strange long cries, the scene gradually calmed down. The barbarians on the mountain peak didn't attack anymore, but quickly gathered and surrounded the southeast. The night was still dark, but it seemed to have faded a little. The bonfire was burning, and black smoke could be seen curling up from the mountain peak. It should be the sparse forest that was set ablaze by the bonfire during the fierce battle. After a while, under the protection of many barbarians, the young commander arrived at a position a few hundred meters away from the mountain peak. He glanced at the silent foot of the mountain and said calmly, "Hello, Bran, welcome to the northern wilderness." Pause for a while. The rocks and trees at the foot of the mountain were silent, and there was no response. He frowned and said, "Why, since you're already here, are you still stingy to meet me?" As soon as he finished speaking, there was a small commotion in the surrounding crowd, and the sound of breathing rose and fell one after another. It turned out that on top of a pile of rocks a few hundred meters away, a bloody figure suddenly appeared out of thin air. He slightly raised his head and slowly looked around. No one dared to meet his sharp gaze, and then he focused his gaze on the young commander. Needless to say, this bloody figure was naturally Tang En. However, at this moment, he was no longer disguised as a barbarian, and was dressed in bloody clothes again. And it wasn't just his clothes. It could be said that the current Tang En was covered in blood from head to toe. He was completely a bloody person who had just climbed out of a blood pool. In just a few breaths, the pile of rocks below him was already soaked in blood, and it spread in all directions. It was a murderous aura and a chilling feeling. Hiss! The two sides were a few hundred meters apart, and there wasn't any eye contact, but Sheeny still gasped and subconsciously hid behind Andre. Good. The young commander was calm and composed. He clapped his hands and smiled. He didn't beat around the bush and directly said, "Surrender, and you can live." The situation in front of them was clear, and there was indeed no need to be hypocritical. If they wanted to live, they had to surrender. Otherwise, they would die. As for glory, splendor, wealth, and so on, they were all smart people. As long as they had their lives, they would naturally have everything. Heh! With an evil laugh, Tang En didn't consider these words at all. He tilted his head and directly raised the dagger to point at the young commander. Then, he pulled it back and slowly drew it across his neck. The standard throat-slitting posture, just like before. This result was actually not unexpected. This was the evil Tang En and not the normal Tang En. If it was the real Tang En, in such a desperate situation, the first thing he would think of would definitely be to fake surrender, and not do something that would easily anger the other party. This definitely couldn't be considered betrayal, and so on. It couldn't even be considered as having no moral integrity. He wasn't from the Bran, and he wasn't even from this world, so there was no such thing as a blood feud. It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that he had many acquaintances and friends on the Bran side, he would have been used to it. It wouldn't be surprising if Tang En had really sided with the northern wilderness tribes. Unfortunately, although the evil Tang En didn't consider this, his evil and arrogant personality made it impossible for him to consider surrendering. As long as he was happy to kill, what harm was there in giving up his life? He had a kind of open-mindedness where he didn't feel sorry for something that didn't belong to him. Without a doubt, Tang En's arrogant actions instantly ignited the anger of countless barbarians. Originally, when death was at hand, he was lucky to be given a chance to surrender. It was fine if he didn't accept it, but he still dared to be so arrogant. Wasn't he looking for death? At this moment, Tang En, who was on top of the pile of rocks, suddenly raised his head and roared, "Kill!" His bloody hair danced in the wind, and he looked like a demon god. The noise in the field was instantly suppressed, and it was almost inaudible. So what if it was 1,000 people? So what if it was 10,000 people? As long as the dagger was still vibrating, as long as the blood hadn't flowed, then they would fight to the death. Fong. Xiao. As if he also felt this crazy and determined killing intent, the young commander didn't say anything to persuade him to surrender. He shook his head slightly, and a trace of regret flashed across his face. He calmly waved his hand, "Let our people withdraw and force him to enter the mountain. Then, set fire to the mountain." Since they had already decided to kill him, the smaller the price, the better. With the soldiers of these 4 tribes guarding the perimeter, Tang En, who was already covered with injuries, definitely wouldn't be able to rush out. Therefore, as long as the soldiers on the mountain withdrew and set fire to the mountain, they would be able to burn Tang En alive. Or, they could shoot Tang En to death when he tried to force his way out. The reason why they didn't do this before was that the young commander did have the intention to recruit him. Secondly, he wanted the soldiers of the tribes to kill this murderer with their own hands to vent their hatred. But now, it was the tribes that failed to live up to expectations, so they couldn't blame anyone else. As soon as the order was given, the barbarian soldiers on the mountain began to withdraw in an orderly manner amidst a few strange whistles. This naturally wouldn't be a problem. Although they couldn't surround Tang En previously, it was still very easy to withdraw by themselves. Even if Tang En noticed and chased after them, how many people could he kill? In fact, Tang En really didn't have the time to care about other things now, because the barbarians on the perimeter had already advanced with bows and arrows. They continuously used arrows to open a path. It was impossible not to retreat to the mountain. Everything seemed to be in order. When a behemoth-like group of forces was activated, the power of a single person was indeed limited. After observing for more than 10 minutes and seeing that the situation was settled, the young commander and his group turned around and retreated. Then, as if he suddenly thought of something, the young commander stopped in his tracks and turned to the tribal chief beside him, asking calmly, "That expert from the Temple of Light hasn't been found yet?" Hearing this, the tribal chief was stunned for a moment. Then, he bowed with an ashamed face and said, we're looking." Waving his hand, the young commander didn't get angry. "Forget it, we don't have time to waste here. Let the other tribes withdraw and prepare to leave the valley." Yes, in the midst of the orders, the surrounding barbarians had already begun to ignite the dead branches and other flammable objects tied to the arrows. The fire attack was about to begin. However, just when the small caravan had finished packing up and was preparing to withdraw first, the tribal chief from before was drenched in sweat as he chased after them. "Phew, sir, wait a minute. That lunatic has already been captured by us. Do we still want to kill him?" Chapter 603. P.S. It's almost the new year, so I have many things to do. I can guarantee that I can write at least 5,000 words a day, but I can't guarantee the update time. Please forgive me. At noon, in the Forbidden Valley. After bustling with noise and excitement for an entire day and night, this place finally returned to its original empty valley, devoid of people and completely silent. Because there was no pervasive cold wind in the north, even the light that had no sense of existence became more lively. It poured down and warmed people's hearts. At this moment, suddenly, there was a rumbling sound. It was like thunder rolling in the clouds, reverberating without anyone noticing. Based on the cloudless weather, it was impossible for such a situation to occur. Looking at the environment here, it was more like a boulder rolling down the hill. In fact, it was exactly so. Somewhere in the Forbidden Valley, on an unknown mountain peak, a boulder that was deliberately shaped into an oval shape was rolling down the slope, crushing a lot of vegetation along the way. Following the trace, the line of sight turned upward. About halfway up the mountain, a hidden cave was suddenly exposed. Then, a figure slowly walked out of the cave. The posture was stiff, and the steps were unsteady, as if it was inconvenient. Her clothes were also ragged, and the silk cloth could not hide her healthy wheat-colored skin at all. Her figure was also tall and curvy, and her two slender jade legs were almost all exposed. Although she subconsciously covered her legs as she walked, some of her exposed body could still be seen, which was very tempting. Needless to say, this person was Sylvia. Tang En still underestimated Sylvia's perseverance. She did not spend a day to get away. When she just woke up, she pushed with her hands and shoulders, gritted her teeth, and in just an hour, she used pure strength to push the boulder at the entrance of the cave away. Rubbing her palm that was badly mutilated because of excessive strength, Sylvia looked stupefied, as if she did not feel the slightest pain. In her eyes, there was no usual determination and persistence. She slowly glanced at the surrounding mountain range. Lifeless, the wilderness was quiet, and the vegetation was silent. As if it also felt the state of mind of the only guest, the Forbidden Valley at this time seemed to be even more dead. She didn't stay here for long. Although from her expression, Sylvia didn't show any signs of recovery, her instincts were already urging her to leave this place of grief as soon as possible. Of course, it was not as bad as evil body Tang En had imagined, where Sylvia would run around naked in the mountains. Not long after entering a dense forest, Sylvia's delicate body was wrapped in layers of animal skins. Those were left behind by the dead barbarians. The northern wilderness tribes didn't have the concept of being buried in peace. Even if they did, it wasn't something that ordinary barbarians could enjoy or care about. The sealed Extreme Valley was indeed empty. After leaving the valley unobstructed, Sylvia's expression finally recovered a little, turning from lifeless to calm. And, at least on the surface, taking a deep breath, Sylvia pursed her lips out of habit and muttered to herself for a few seconds. Then, she reached out her hand and made a few mysterious gestures in front of her chest. Dots of white light gathered around her like swallows returning to the forest. After leaving the sealed extreme valley, she naturally had do-chi. Although the amount of do-chi that could be accumulated in such a short time was very little, it was more than enough to release a tracking magic. When the light dispersed, Sylvia suddenly turned her head and looked towards the northeast. Her calm expression disappeared in an instant and was replaced by a mixture of unwillingness, hatred, resentment, and many other negative emotions. For a moment, a rarely seen ruthless killing intent appeared on her holy face. Phew! After a long while, Sylvia let out a long breath. Her expression gradually calmed down. Then, she bit her lower lip and frowned, as if she was struggling with something. But after all, she was a decisive person. Very quickly, she stomped her feet and walked towards the south. That was the direction of Bran. Just as Tangan had speculated, after sensing the tracking magic, she found out that he didn't die in the sealed extreme valley. Moreover, he was now a long distance away. She had no choice but to give up this pursuit. There was no need for this. In the previous 10 days of pursuit, both sides had fought many times in close proximity, but in the end, Sylvia still didn't succeed. Not to mention now that they were tens of kilometers apart. One must know that this didn't only represent the distance. There was also the difference in speed between the two sides and Tang En, who had fully recovered. It could be said that Sylvia had already lost the best opportunity to kill Tang En because of this. Of course, Sylvia could also continue to pursue and kill regardless of the consequences. She had done so before. But the situation was different now. Her identity and whereabouts had been completely exposed. Moreover, she wasn't good at concealment. If she continued to pursue, it was very likely that she would be surrounded by the barbarians again before she could catch up to Tang En. It would be a complete loss. Therefore, the only thing Sylvia could do now was to return to Bran. But after taking a few steps, Sylvia's delicate body suddenly shook. She felt a tearing pain in her lower body. She subconsciously stopped and bent over. Ugh! Sylvia let out an extremely vexed roar. She straightened her body with an ashen complexion. Her resolute expression had recovered a lot. Then, as if he was fighting against something invisible, he once again took a big step forward and walked straight ahead. It could be seen that Sylvia was very cautious now. She wasn't like before where she could move around freely. She chose to take remote paths or directly enter the forest. Not long after, Sylvia's footsteps stopped again when she was crossing over a hill. This time, it wasn't because of any annoying reason. Instead, it was because of a small lake in the gully ahead. Under the reflection of the sunlight, the surface of the ice was glistening and was quite eye-catching. Sylvia stared blankly for a while. She seemed to be thinking about something. Then, she pursed her lips and walked over without hesitation. It was now the coldest season in the northern wilderness, and this place was not a forbidden valley with a special topography. Therefore, even though it was noon and the sun was shining brightly, a thick layer of ice had formed on the surface of this small lake, and the chill was penetrating to the bone. After getting close, Sylvia first walked around the small lake. This lake was located in the middle of a cluster of hills, and was quite hidden. It should have been a depression in the past. After accumulating enough rain and snow, it finally formed this lake. Other than some traces of beasts, there were no signs of human habitation. Seeing this, Sylvia walked behind a huge rock beside the lake. Rustle, rustle, rustle. After a moment, a slender jade leg stepped out first. Then, her entire body walked out without a single piece of clothing. Her breasts were tall, smooth. They looked untainted by the mortal world, but they were like two plum blossoms. The grass was luxuriant, neither dense nor sparse. It was like fertile land, but it hid the curve of a valley. There was no concealment, no restraint. In a calm state, Sylvia's face was pure and holy. She stepped onto the ice with confidence. Her well-proportioned jade feet and the crystal-clear amber-like ice reflected each other's radiance. She walked towards the center of the lake at a steady pace. This scene was like a holy snow lotus that bloomed out of thin air in the snow, spitting out its fragrance to the heavens and earth. One could only look at it from afar. One could not bear to profane it. At this moment, the valley was silent. It seemed that even the raging cold wind was unwilling to disturb her. It only carefully blew her waist-length hair gently, adding a bit of charm to it. Unknowingly, Sylvia walked to the center of the lake. She looked around and lightly stomped her jade feet. The surroundings were filled with a dense holy light. In the next moment, whoosh! The thick layer of ice under Sylvia's body suddenly grew many branches. Then, in just a few short breaths, they rapidly spread to the surroundings like a spiderweb. Finally, bang! The ice surface shattered and water splashed everywhere. Her beautiful and delicate body instantly disappeared from the layer of ice and fell straight into the lake. Just as mentioned before, the climate in the northern wilderness was extremely cold. Needless to say, the thick layer of ice on the lake water was even colder. It was obvious just by looking at the wisps of coldness that permeated the air. However, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Soon, 5 minutes had passed. Sylvia was still hidden deep in the cold lake water. She did not show herself. If one could see through the layer of ice and the lake water, they would see Sylvia hugging her knees with her long hair buried in her head. She was like a child who had her candy stolen. She sat quietly at the bottom of the lake, allowing the endless cold lake water to surround and wash her delicate body cold, bone-chilling coldness. If she could wash away the filth on her body, wash away all the smell and traces left behind by that disgusting fellow. So what if it was 100 times colder? This was a resolute way of doing things. It also contained some helplessness and self-deception. Sylvia had never been a coward. She had fought for as many years as she had finished her apprenticeship. Strong enemies, difficult situations, bloody battles. She had faced countless of them head-on, and countless times she had escaped from danger by the skin of her teeth. Sylvia felt that she was strong enough. She was also determined and fearless, but her delicate body gradually trembled. Her slender fingers slowly and deeply sank into the ice. The humiliating scenes from before unconsciously flashed past her mind. She still panicked, was afraid, and didn't know what to do. I humiliated you, kissed you. Where is your God? Night's flower, ordinary goods, not even comparable to nightingale, so despicable that it disgusts my appetite. The humiliating words were like a demon's voice that constantly hovered in her mind. Every sentence was aimed at her heart. The surroundings seemed to have sensed Sylvia's turbulent emotions. Waves of ripples surged and spread out, and undercurrents surged suddenly. A ball of light exploded at the bottom of the lake. Vaguely, Sylvia's long hair fluttered in the wind. She opened her hands wide and roared towards the sky. Ah, boom! 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 In an instant, all the layers of ice on the surface of the lake directly shattered into pieces. The previously stagnant lake seemed to have suddenly rushed into the sea. Waves rose high and roared as they slapped the two sides, causing countless splashes of water to surge out in Sylvia's view. As long as Tangan left the Forbidden Valley, with his abnormal speed, more than 10,000 barbarians would not be able to catch up with him. Therefore, Tangan's current position should be dozens of kilometers away in the northeast direction, and he should be running away at high speed. But was this the truth? In the northeast direction, about 50 kilometers away. On the winding mountain road, densely packed black dots that looked like ants were constantly moving forward. These were the barbarians that had previously surrounded the Forbidden Valley. But now there were less than 10,000 of them. It was not because of casualties. Of course, Tang En and Sylvia had killed many of them. But the main reason was that the battle had ended, and most of the tribes had turned back. As for the thousands of barbarians that were still following them, It was only because it was on the way. At this time, in the center of the group, "Brother Andre, what flower is that?" "Well, it's so beautiful. Can you go and pick it for me? I'll show it to you." "Well, Brother Andre, well? What's wrong, Sydney? You're ignoring me." After coming back to his senses, Andre looked at Sydney, who was pouting and had an "I'm very unhappy" expression written all over her face. He was stunned for a moment, then he scratched his head embarrassedly and said with a smile, "How could that be? Sorry, I was lost in my thoughts just now, so—" "Well, wait a moment." "Oh." Sydney nodded her head noncommittally. It seemed like she still had some grievances, but in reality, after seeing her sweetheart sincerely apologize, the dissatisfaction in her heart had already calmed down. She then looked at Andre, who quickly got down from his horse and went to pick the flowers that she said were beautiful. The corner of her mouth unconsciously rose into a smile, looking reserved and happy. "Here, for you." Andre, who had just turned around, was about to hand over the flowers when he saw Sydney moving closer to him. After being stunned for a moment, he immediately reacted and put the flowers behind Sydney's ears. "Thank you, hee." Sydney sat up straight and turned her head. She grabbed a strand of her long hair and smiled with her eyes squinted. "Brother Andre, is it beautiful?" "Of course it's beautiful." "Then is the flowers beautiful, or am I beautiful?" "The flowers are beautiful, but you're more beautiful." It had to be said that when a man faced a woman's temper, some words were almost instinctive. Even if they didn't show much sincerity, they could still make the other party smile like a flower. Sydney was undoubtedly in such a state right now. She couldn't stop the joy from spreading from the corner of her mouth to her entire face. Anyone could see that she was very happy right now. Not only did she not mind Andre's attitude from before, she even asked considerately, "Right, Brother Andre, what were you thinking about just now?" "Oh, nothing, just a little confused." Shaking his head slightly, Andre looked ahead and said with a frown, "We still don't have a clue about what we want to do, but now we're going back." "Why is that?" Sydney heard this and opened her mouth. She obviously didn't know the answer, but then she blinked and said, "This? We can ask the commander directly." She was the one who set the route. "I wanted to ask." Scratching his head, Andre helplessly pointed to the side. Over there was the young commander who was also riding a horse. But at this moment, her eyes were in a daze. Her hands were constantly rubbing something. Obviously, she was absent-minded. "Hey, do you see? We've been walking for half a day, but the commander didn't even raise her head. She kept looking at that jade pendant. How am I supposed to ask?" "Jade pendant." Sydney heard this and her expression changed. The corner of her mouth twitched. She looked at Andre with some hesitation. That Andre was quite sensitive. He asked in surprise, "Sydney, could it be that you know something?" "It's not that I know anything, it's just that." Muttering in a low voice, Sydney couldn't bear to hide it from her sweetheart. She deliberately moved closer and whispered, "I'll tell you. Don't tell anyone else. Yes, there were a few times when I saw a wolf-shaped jade pendant exactly like this one. It seems to be the other half." "While what?" Hearing this, Andre was shocked. But seeing Sydney continuously making a shushing gesture, he instantly reacted. He lowered his voice, his face full of disbelief. But this jade pendant was found on that crazy Bran." "I know." Turning her head, she carefully looked at the young commander. The latter wasn't alarmed. She was still looking at the jade pendant in her hand, lost in thought. Sydney saw this and sighed in relief. She continued, "Commander should have seen this jade pendant at the Empress place. That's why she's like this now." "But this? Why is this?" Sydney bit her lips. She seemed to be hesitant. But looking at the valiant Andre, she seemed to have thrown caution to the wind. She said in a low voice, "Forget it. I'll tell you some more things. Yes, this is just a rumor. I've only heard about it occasionally. I don't know if it's true or not. Anyway, you definitely can't tell others. Otherwise, we might all die. This Sydney's identity was somewhat special. She seemed to have access to many secrets. Hearing this, Andre naturally nodded repeatedly. His expression was somewhat nervous. I really don't know if I should say this or not. Sigh. You know, the Empress was born intelligent. It's said that she was already proficient in the Bran language since she was young. Plus, her body shape and appearance were almost no different from the Bran people. So 10 years ago, she secretly snuck out of the Imperial City, trekked thousands of miles, and made a trip to the Bran. The Empress had been to the Bran? How was this possible? Hearing such shocking news right from the start, Andre's eyes widened. After that, the Empress seemed to have stayed in the Bran for a long time. It wasn't until the Empress's father, the previous Wolf King, was critically ill that the Empress rushed back. Then, there was a rumor that the Empress seemed to have fallen in love with a Bran person during the time she was in the Bran. She even gave half of her jade pendant to him as a token of love. And, I heard that the Empress was already pregnant when she returned. Oh, cough cough. Andre forcefully suppressed his involuntary scream. His face immediately flushed red, and he coughed incessantly. Now he knew why Sydney had always emphasized that this couldn't be spread. This matter not only concerned the Empress's reputation, but also had a wide range of implications. Other things aside, if the pregnancy was true, then His Highness Tiu was a Bran person's child? This was too freaking terrifying. But no matter what, if this matter really came out of their mouths and became a big deal, then they definitely wouldn't be able to live. Brother Andre, how are you? Sydney was very anxious. She hurriedly patted Andre's back. He waved his hand. I'm fine. Cough cough. And continue. No, that's all. Commander is so alert. You must have heard this rumor. That's why you're staring blankly at the jade pendant. Sydney shook her head. Her gaze towards the young commander was somewhat worried. It's possible. That's not right. Andre suddenly raised his eyebrows. He subconsciously turned to look behind him. That Bran madman is at most 20 years old. How could he have any relationship with the Empress? Sydney shook her head. I don't know. Maybe the rumor is false. Maybe the Empress's sweetheart accidentally lost the jade pendant, and it ended up in his hands. That's true. And? He nodded in agreement. Suddenly, Andre's brows furrowed. He saw a figure rushing towards them. Andre recognized this person. It was the person the commander had ordered him to personally go to the northeast to investigate if there was any news of Z. Could it be that there was news so quickly? This barbarian was also an expert in the caravan. His speed was naturally not slow. Soon, he arrived in front of them, his body covered in dust. He was panting. Huff. Sir, I just received news. Huff. 10 days ago, Z brought 20,000 Bran soldiers and broke into the hinterland of the tribe. They should have already killed their way to the Imperial City in the northern wilderness. Huff, damn it. What? Andre and Sydney heard this and their expressions changed greatly. They both cried out involuntarily. And? The young commander on the side was startled. He raised his head and looked over, his face full of confusion. Chapter 604. Grand Wilderness City. As everyone knew, due to various subjective and objective reasons, there weren't many buildings in the northern wilderness. As one of the few cities in the northern wilderness and the largest one, Grand Wilderness City naturally had a special status. In fact, if Grand Wilderness City was popularly known as the Imperial City of the Northern Wilderness, that would be a well-known existence in the Caesar continent. Of course, for the Bran people, such an existence was only limited to their imagination. It wasn't because the Bran's investigation system was too useless. Grand Wilderness City stood there and couldn't be moved. As long as they put in some effort and sent more spies, they would always be able to find this somewhat mysterious city. The reason why there wasn't much news about Grand Wilderness City in the Bran market was because the situation in the country had changed in recent years. Just as Z.E. had said before, the Northern Wilderness had been working hard for the past 10 years and had achieved great results, especially in terms of military affairs. Although there were suspicions that the Northern Wilderness was overly militaristic, it had indeed made rapid progress. It was undoubtedly better than the Bulan front line, which had remained stagnant. Therefore, the Bran people, who couldn't even protect themselves, naturally wouldn't waste time to study Grand Wilderness City. Ordinary people in Bulan City were naturally hostile to Northern Wasteland clans. Therefore, the rumors circulating in Bulan City were that the so-called Northern Wasteland Royal City was actually a simple village. They despised the Northern Wasteland Royal City. But in fact, the afterglow of the setting sun was like blood. The cold wind was blowing, and the sky was filled with wailing and howling. Right on this desolate and barren land, Grand Desolation City was like a towering mountain range that had existed since the ancient times, and it stood with its head held high. The wall was about 30 meters high and was made up of many weathered but extremely thick and hard boulders. The color of the wall was mainly gray and black, but now it had been dyed with a layer of metallic bronze. It was modeled like the legendary stone muscles of the ancient giants, full of tenacious and powerful beauty. There was no need to say more about the appearance of the city. There was only one thing to know, in terms of the defensive ability of the wall itself. Grand Wilderness City absolutely had the capital to look down on the entire Caesar continent. Of course, this was necessary. After all, they were the face of the Northern Wilderness tribes. Naturally, they couldn't be as bad as the Bran people thought. Moreover, there was another important reason, which was that the environment and climate here were too harsh. Ordinary cities might not be able to withstand the powerful attacks of the hurricanes. But now, this heavy-duty city that had stood tall in the Northern Wilderness for countless years finally did not have to bear the teasing of the natural climate anymore. Instead, it returned to its proper business. This time, it was facing a real military attack. The 4 iron gates were tightly shut, and the tall and majestic city walls were already filled with soldiers who were waiting solemnly. Since they were at the foot of the imperial city, these barbarians were no longer wearing simple animal skins. Instead, they were all wearing metal armor. Although it wasn't standardized, for the Northern Wilderness tribes, whose craftsmanship was severely lacking, it was already very valuable. At the same time, all kinds of large defensive equipment were pushed out one after another on the city wall, including a few Mjolnir. The metal cannons were slowly raised and pointed at the sky at a 45-degree angle. Needless to say, this was snatched from the Bran's front line. Overall, the military strength of the Great Wilderness City was not as good as the few major fortresses in the Bran's front line. Of course, this was also normal. For a group that couldn't even popularize standard armor, it was really difficult for them to make something as exquisite as Mjolnir. What's more, the Northern Wilderness tribe was good at fighting head-on or running away after snatching the loot. Defense was really a strange word for them. Therefore, they naturally didn't need these cumbersome defensive equipment. However, now that the barbarians on the city wall had given up their advantage of being good at fighting in the open field, it was really strange and rare. At this moment, suddenly there was a commotion on the city wall. There were gasps, exclamations, and subconsciously slaps on the city wall. All kinds of sounds and movements that were full of shock instantly mixed together to form a low buzzing sound. This was the south gate of the Great Wilderness City. There was a vast plain in front of it. Right now, in the eyes of the barbarians on the city wall, there was a long line of blurry black shadows running towards them. Although they couldn't see clearly, from the unique and fast running posture, the barbarians on the city wall could obviously recognize this so-called line of black shadows. It was the trump card of the Northern Wilderness, the wilderness wolf riders. The speed of the wilderness wolf riders was needless to say, not to mention that they were running on this vast plain. However, because of this, the barbarians couldn't help but cry out as their vision became clearer. It turned out that the formation of the wilderness wolf riders was very strange. They were scattered like stragglers and looked to be in a difficult situation. Moreover, some of the sharp-eyed barbarians could see that there were no people on the back of some of the green-armored wolves. Or there were people on the back of some of the green-armored wolves, but in the next moment, their bodies suddenly tilted and directly fell to the ground. In an instant, they were drowned by the wolves. Looking at this situation, it didn't look like they were coming to help, but more like they were being chased away. Hiss! Realizing this, the barbarians on the city wall sucked in their breath. The hearts of the barbarians sank. They couldn't believe their eyes. This was the trump card of the Northern Wilderness royal family, the elite wilderness wolf riders. Why did they look like stray dogs now? However, regardless of whether they believed it or not, the truth was still the truth. Just as the wilderness wolf riders were about to reach the city wall, a black shadow suddenly appeared at the end of their line of sight. Needless to say, it was this black shadow that turned the wilderness wolf riders into stray dogs. He actually came. Is that Z.E.? He's F** King courting death. Seeing this scene, the barbarians on the city wall looked at each other and couldn't help but start discussing. They were able to set up a defense here early on, so naturally they had received the news. In fact, about 2 days ago, they had already heard that Z had led 20,000 soldiers into the heart of the northern wilderness, slaughtering countless tribes along the way. They were completely unstoppable. However, they never would have thought that the enemy would actually completely break through the northern wilderness and directly reach the royal city in the northern wilderness. As the saying goes, a man's name is like a tree's shadow. At that time, Z's name had already shaken the world. He had firmly suppressed the northern wilderness tribes for dozens of years. Now that he was really in front of them, it was impossible for the northern wilderness to not be afraid. It was probably because of this that these barbarians gave up the advantage of fighting in the open and obediently hid behind the city wall. After the large group of wilderness wolf riders arrived at the city gate in an extremely sorry state, they didn't choose to enter the city. Of course, now that a war was about to break out, the great wilderness city wouldn't open the heavy city gate for them. The wilderness wolf riders obviously knew this, so they didn't cry out in fear. Instead, they spread out along the towering city wall. This was already within the attack range of the city defense equipment. No matter how anxious Z was, he couldn't immediately attack the city in such a hurry. In other words, they were currently safe and only needed to go around the great wilderness city in time. In a moment, about 5 li away from the great wilderness city, which was outside the attack range of the Thor's hammer, Zichen's soldiers wearing pitch-black armor stopped in their tracks. They raised their heads slightly and looked at the great wilderness city in the distance. This Zichen's 9th Army, which was personally created by Z, was unknown before it was born. Once it was born, it was like a sharp sword being unsheathed, pointing its cold light everywhere. Without sleep, without rest, without fighting to the death, in a short period of 10 days, with a shocking momentum, they broke through the hinterland of the northern wilderness, sweeping in all directions, and finally arrived here. At this moment, it was obvious that the formation of the 9th Army was no longer complete. Before they set off, there were more than 20,000 left, but now there were only 8,000 left. And these remaining soldiers, almost none of them were uninjured, and none of them weren't bleeding. Looking from afar, they were no different from mourning soldiers whose morale was extremely low. But the current situation was different. After facing the rain of blades and arrows for 10 days, and tasting the wind and rain of blood for 10 days, their expressions were still wooden, and their eyes were even more lifeless. It could be said that the soldiers of the 9th Army who nurtured themselves through battle could no longer be measured by the eyes of ordinary people. Now, just by simply standing there, They were as still as a mountain. In an instant, the wilderness was silent, and a tragic atmosphere that was so fierce that one could smell the cold light of blades and the pungent smell of blood slowly spread out. P.S. Sorry, Raccoon neglected that there is a small bug in chapter 505. Sylvia called out Tangen's name, but in fact, she didn't know Tangen's name and real face. Well, as long as you know, Raccoon will correct it as soon as possible. It won't affect your reading. Here, thank you, book friend Green Bamboo and Beautiful Moon. Chapter 605. Beep, the sky was clear and the sun was cold. In the silence, a black shadow flashed across the horizon. It spread its wings and circled in the sky. It should be an eagle. It was quite big and seemed to be curious about the confrontation between the two armies. It paused for a while, then raised its head and screeched. At this moment, the top of the wall was also silent. Most of the barbarians held their weapons tightly and stared at the cold eyes that were not far away. Their bodies were tense. Aura was something that couldn't be seen or touched, but it was real. The aura of the 9 armies was so strong that even though they were 5 miles away, the barbarians on the wall still felt their breathing stop. The murderous aura was almost unstoppable. After a while, a barbarian officer in high-grade armor looked up at the giant eagle in the sky and squinted. He then waved his hand to the side. "Haha, brand bastards, you have the guts to come to me. Well, it saves me the trouble of traveling thousands of miles to find you. Come, let me break your skulls. Where is Z? Don't tell me you're a coward." Mockery, insults, curses, threats. In just a few breaths, the top of the wall suddenly burst into a commotion and broke the silence of the battlefield. The soldiers of the 9 armies didn't show any anger when they heard the commotion. Or rather, their expressions didn't change at all. They were calm and cold, as if they didn't feel anything. In the next moment, the soldiers in the middle of the army slowly spread to the sides and made a path. Then, a light purple figure appeared in front of the barbarians. Purple. He really came out. The soldiers of the 9 armies were wearing black armor. Maybe it was because they were stained with too much blood, but their armor was turning dark red. But no matter what, it looked like they were all wearing the same armor. The sudden appearance of the light purple figure made the barbarians recognize Z. Suddenly, there was an uproar. No matter whether they admitted it or not, or no matter how much they hated it, the name Z had a special charm in the northern wilderness tribes. It could always touch the chord of respect, panic, and fear in their hearts, making them tremble uncontrollably. Then, after a short moment, the uproar gradually died down. This was not because Z was pressuring them. In fact, Z was currently sitting on a simple wooden chair, which was lifted up by 4 soldiers, with his head lowered. It looked like a stretcher. It wasn't that he was putting on airs. Anyone who saw Z's body trembling and coughing while covering his mouth would know that he wasn't in a good state. If there were any sharp-eyed barbarians who were able to approach this place, they would discover that Z's condition was much more serious than they had imagined. When he met Tangen, Z's face was still pale. Although he could see that he was not in good health, he would not think that he was dead. If that was the case, his face was ashen and his eyes were closed, and a faint purple light could be seen between his closed eyes. That was because the poison had invaded his brain, and there was nothing he could do about it. His life was coming to an end. After exiting the center of the army, the 4 soldiers did not stop and continued to carry Z to the front of the army. The closer he got, the clearer his vision became. Looking at this sickly person who seemed to be able to be pushed down with a finger, the barbarians could not help but collectively stare. This was Z? This was the brand god of war, whose name shook the continent. This was the abyss demon who had suppressed us for decades? What kind of joke was this? The disparity between imagination and reality made all the barbarians on the city wall dumbfounded at this moment. They even forgot that Z had entered the attack range of Mjolnir. Beep! An eagle's cry sounded, and a murderous aura instantly erupted. Ha ha! Z, you little brat, die! Amidst the wild laughter, a black shadow suddenly fell from the sky, bringing with it a sky full of black gas as it fell rapidly, directly aiming at Z's position below. To be able to launch an attack in the air, it was naturally a void-level warrior. The fact was that the black gas that covered the sky was indeed the power of a void-level warrior. As everyone knew, a void-level warrior could float in the air. Of course, the sky was not dark, and there were no clouds for thousands of miles. If a living person stood in the air, he would naturally be noticed. But now that he had launched an attack from the back of the giant eagle, everything could be explained. In the northern wilderness there was a large tribe called the Berserk Eagle Tribe. The elite soldiers of this tribe were the Falcon Air Cavalry that Tang En had seen before. That kind of giant eagle had no problem carrying a person. Obviously, this was an assassination that had been planned for a long time. The barbarians on the city wall instantly came back to their senses. Looking at the black shadow that was constantly approaching at high speed, they suddenly became very nervous and excited. Could it succeed? Would Z be killed on the spot like this? It was a pity that they did not place their gazes on ZE. Otherwise, they would not be so agitated. At this time, Z was still covering his mouth and coughing, like a candle in the wind that would be extinguished in the next moment. The expressions of the four soldiers did not change at all. They continued to carry the wooden chair forward, as if they did not see the imminent disaster that was about to befall them. The next moment, pung pung pung. Then boom boom boom, debris flew everywhere, but the smoke did not dissipate. The crisp explosions came from the air, as well as several places outside the great wilderness city. The smoke in the air had not completely dissipated, but there were several large pits on the ground, surrounded by scattered scorched earth. Whether it was in the air or on the ground, the figure of the Void Master who had been laughing wildly just now had disappeared. The scene was silent. The expressions and movements of the barbarians froze a second ago. They stood on the city wall in a completely petrified state. Just now, what happened? In fact, the barbarians on the city wall had a good view of what had just happened. It was just that they had not recovered for a while, or perhaps it was because they could not accept it. Just a moment ago, when the Void Master in the northern wilderness fell vertically about 50 meters above Z's head, more than a dozen red flames shot out from behind Zichen's army. The red flames flashed in the air and instantly covered an area of 50 meters in the air. Then, a few of the flames hit the Void Master's figure and bloomed into a large firework. The other flames brushed past the Void Master and exploded in the open space in front of him. In such a short period of time, a void-level cultivator with a lofty status and identity had been completely obliterated. Even under the black smoke, the barbarians could only hear his voice, but did not see what he looked like. The barbarians did not know that the weapon that killed the Void Master was the unknown weapon that Z had spent 8 years researching. It was also the only heavy weapon that the soldiers of the 9 armies had brought to the northern wilderness. In the past 10 days, many of the soldiers of the 9 armies had mastered it. Of course, no matter how skilled they were, it was impossible to hit a figure moving at high speed in the air. But if they had known that there was someone hiding on the giant eagle, they would have aimed the cannons 50 meters above Z's path. Then everything would have been much simpler. It was a pity that the Void Master had deliberately controlled the giant eagle to fly high in order to achieve the ideal hiding effect. Then, in order to kill him in one shot, he did not hold back at all. Just like that, he used all of his strength to fall straight down. It had to be known that no matter how fast the falling speed was, at such a high distance, the soldiers of the 9 armies would have at least a few seconds to react, not to mention they already knew that this guy was hiding behind the giant eagle. Then when the exploding crystals were shot out, the void-level warrior had no way to dodge at all. He could only watch as the black gas he emitted blew up the exploding crystals. This was how the tragedy was born. So everything happened and ended in an instant. When everyone regained their senses, they could only see the smoke in the air. In the silent scene, only ZE and the 4 soldiers who did not even bat an eyelid were still moving forward. However, they did not go far. Their purpose was mainly to lure the Void Master to attack, but now that the other party was dead, there was no need to continue moving forward and send him into the precise shooting range of Mjolnir. For miles away from the great desolate city, the 4 soldiers stopped. Their bodies did not move at all as they steadily lifted the wooden chair. Immediately, ZE, who was sitting on the wooden chair, suddenly turned pale. She forcefully suppressed the coughing sound back into her throat. Her body slumped backwards as her chest heaved up and down. She raised her head to look at the majestic, great, desolate city in front of her, and the corners of her mouth curled up into a smile. "Haha, I finally made it here." Chapter 606. The empty space in front of the city was silent. It had to be said that as soon as Zeepu appeared, he first drove the wilderness wolf riders away like stray dogs. Then he plotted against a void-level warrior and directly killed him. This had a huge impact on the barbarians. The people on the wall were speechless for a while. At this time, cough cough, it was just a short sentence, but it seemed to have used up a lot of Z's energy. He couldn't stop coughing. He wiped his trembling hand, and it was a shocking purplish red, slightly shaking his head. Z calmly put down his hand, as if he was used to it. Or maybe he didn't care. He looked up at the great barren city and said calmly, "Come out and see me. Come out and see me. Come out and see me. Come out and see me." His tone was calm, but it instantly crossed the towering wall and covered the sky above the great barren city, echoing for a long time. Regarding Z's strength, whether it was in the northern wilderness tribes or in the Bran Empire, it had always been a mystery. First of all, as the commander of an army, his strength should be quite good. But because of his prominent position, no one had seen him personally fight for many years. Now that they heard his words, which were as calm as if he was speaking in front of them, but could slowly spread and not disperse, they knew that his control of his strength had reached a terrifying level. But, after a while, there was no response from the great barren city. But the barbarians on the wall came back to their senses and looked at each other with an inexplicable expression. "Come out and see me." Who would come out and see you? You, Z, as the god of war of the Bran Empire, the biggest threat to the tribe. Could it be that you know someone in the royal city? Sigh. Another sigh was heard, and it was faint like the ripples on the lake's surface. Z lowered her eyes and leaned back in her chair, as if she had lost all her strength. Her eyes were filled with sadness and disappointment. After a few seconds, he waved his arm and pointed at the great barren city. Whoosh! The heavy atmosphere instantly turned into a murderous and bloody atmosphere. There was no roar of command, no pre-battle encouragement, just a casual gesture, and the previously unmoving soldiers of the 9 armies suddenly surged forward like a primordial undercurrent, a desperate aura instantly enveloping the entire battlefield. Boom! What the F***ck are you standing there for? Fire the cannons! Everyone, listen up! Infantry, step forward and raise your shields. Archers, raise your bows. Boom! Within a short period of time, the city wall of the grand desolate city was filled with hubbub. To be honest, they had never seen such a battle. Just a second ago, the 2 armies were still facing each other, and the whole place was silent. But in the next moment, as if they had all been injected with chicken blood, they instantly went berserk, and without any warning, they fiercely attacked. What the F***ck? The changes were too fast, and he couldn't get used to it at all. Fortunately, the barbarians had the advantage in the terrain and had made all the necessary preparations beforehand. As soon as the officer gave the order, the Thor's hammers took the initiative to fire. The 9 armies weren't in a tight formation, but they didn't disperse either. They were in the same formation as when they were chasing the wilderness wolf riders. Now that they had rushed into the attack range of the Thor's hammers, their limbs flew everywhere, and their bodies fell to the ground. The casualties were not small. This kind of situation was actually quite normal. Just like how the Bran had relied on the high walls to block the northern wilderness's countless invasions, the most difficult battle was always the battle to win. According to the normal pattern of this battle, the side that took the initiative to attack would usually have the advantage in numbers. Therefore, the best strategy was to form layers of encirclement and trap the enemy behind the defense, cutting off all supplies and breaking out of the encirclement. In this way, although it would take a lot of time, it was the most reliable way to win, and also the tactic with the least casualties. Of course, the world often didn't go as planned. If there was a time limit or strategic considerations, they had to forcefully attack as soon as possible. But they should still spread their forces around, and then form an advantage in numbers. They would then look for the weak points in the enemy's defense and concentrate their forces to attack. Once they had gained a firm foothold, they would then slowly break down the enemy's entire defense system. This was the best strategy for a battle. But Zichen's 9 armies had arrived for only a short while, and they had already forcefully attacked from one side, as if they were going to swallow everything in one go. But they only had 8,000 soldiers, which was even less than the number of barbarians in the great wilderness city. Such an inexplicable confidence was truly incomprehensible. But the barbarians on the wall didn't feel humiliated because of this. Everyone was serious and even a little nervous. Just like what Anglos had said before, half jokingly and half emotionally, if I could sacrifice 100,000 warriors in exchange for Z's death, I would agree to this deal without any hesitation. Therefore, not to mention that there were only 8,000 Zichen soldiers in front of them, even if Z had come alone, the pressure on them wouldn't be any less. Sure enough, after a round of bombardment from the Thor's hammer, Zichen's 9 armies had forced their way to 2 miles in front of the city. Then, in the eyes of the barbarians on the wall, there were a dozen or so points in the chaotic undercurrent. Squinting their eyes, they saw that there were a few Zichen soldiers who seemed to be arranging something. Hiss! Quick, bombard there, bombard there! Seeing this scene, a senior barbarian officer on the wall gasped. His face changed dramatically, and he immediately became anxious. Jumping up and down, he ordered the dozen or so Thor's hammers to adjust their muzzles and aim at that direction. Z had led the 9 armies into the northern wilderness for more than 10 days, causing a bloody storm along the way. So, the barbarians naturally collected all kinds of information about this terrifying army. Among them, besides Z himself, the thing that made them tremble and drool the most was this kind of heavy weapon that looked like a small version of the Thor's hammer. And just a moment ago, this weapon had already shown its power. Although there were all kinds of calculations, it was an indisputable fact that a void-grade warrior had directly disappeared in the air with just a dozen or so shots. The muzzle of the Thor's hammer was still hot. Under the rapid shaking of the wrench below, it slowly lowered and adjusted the muzzle position. After a simple aiming, a barbarian at the back picked up a big explosive crystal and prepared to load it. But at this time, bang bang bang! More than 10 flaming lights quickly flashed across the barbarian's eyes and landed somewhere on the wall. Bang! 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 Flames soared to the sky, and violent explosions sounded everywhere. The towering city wall trembled continuously, as if an earthquake had suddenly occurred. Some of the huge rocks on the battlements fell from the sky with a whistling sound, and the momentum was astonishing. Because of the line of sight, the soldiers below the city wall could not see the situation inside. But near the city wall, countless barbarians were hit by the shock waves and were involuntarily sent flying. Their screams and cries instantly resounded in the air, and then they fell one after another like raindrops. Bang bang bang! It must be known that the city wall of the wasteland was nearly 10 feet high. Falling from such a height, even the barbarians with thick skin and thick muscles were smashed into rotten persimmons. In fact, the unknown weapon developed by Z was not so powerful, but its installation and firing speed were extremely fast. Before the barbarians on the wall could launch a second round of attacks, the explosive crystals had already smashed over. And all the targets were aimed at the metal cannon, which was the location of the Thor's hammer. In this way, even if the soldiers of the 9 armies did not hit accurately, they would still be able to detonate the large explosive crystals in that area. The consequences were self-evident. In just a short moment, the situation of the battle had been reversed. The Thor's hammer that the barbarians had obtained with great difficulty and transported back thousands of miles had become Z's accomplice after just one round of attack. And this not only brought about a loss of defensive power, but more importantly, the archers' formation outside the city wall was also destroyed in an instant. It was not an exaggeration to say that with this attack, the fate of the barbarian officer in charge of the defense of the city wall was decided. He was going to die without a doubt. As soon as the battle started, the towering city wall that the barbarians had placed high hopes on was immediately disarmed. Of course, none of the barbarians had expected this result, but in fact, there was an inevitability hidden in this accident. Z's weapon of mass destruction had just been invented, and it had brought about various changes in strategy and tactic. Other than Z, no one else in this world would know about it. After the first round of attacks had destroyed the defensive system of the city wall, Zichen's soldiers quickly adjusted their cannon muzzles and aimed at the thick city gate in front of them. Although one side of the city wall of the wasteland city had been blasted open, it was nothing compared to the 10 feet high city wall. Not to mention that the soldiers of the 9 armies did not bring any ladders. Even if they did, it would be impossible for them to reach such a height, since the city wall was already so high. The city gate of the wasteland city would naturally not be weak either. However, under continuous bombardment, the city gate could still be blasted open. As expected, after more than 10 heavy weapons aimed at the city gate and bombarded it together, smoke rose from the city gate, and gravel flew everywhere. Then, there was a thunderous sound of the city gate collapsing, and the ground kept shaking. The city gate of the wasteland city was officially broken. Just like how the northern wilderness tribes had never attacked the capital of the Bran, the royal city of the northern wilderness had never faced an attack from the Bran before dusk. However, at this moment, this saying had become history. The city gate had just fallen, and the smoke had yet to disperse. Large groups of barbarians waved their iron rods, and their faces were ferocious. They rushed out of the city like a tide. After knowing that the person who had invaded the northern wilderness was Z, and that he had such a powerful weapon, the people of the northern wilderness had already expected that the city gate of the wasteland city would be broken. Therefore, except for the city wall, all the soldiers in the city were basically gathered behind the city gate. What they didn't expect was that the defense system of the city wall was so unreliable, and the city gate was broken so quickly. Compared to the shock and fear of the barbarians, Z, who was sitting at the back of the battlefield, was much quieter. Of course, it was a basic quality for a general to stay calm in the face of a battle. Z certainly didn't lack this quality. However, he was sitting like a statue, and the purple blood was constantly seeping out of the corner of his mouth, which only made people think of a hero who had passed away silently. Of course, Z didn't die, at least not now. After hearing the huge city gate collapsing, Z opened his eyes slightly, but he was looking at the top of the wasteland city. As for the fierce battle in front of him, it seemed that it had nothing to do with him. His body moved, as if he wanted to sit up straight, but he didn't succeed. Only his helmet was slightly off the back of the chair. He exhaled, and his chest rose and fell. "Come out and see me." His voice was still flat, and it still suppressed all kinds of noises. It lingered in the sky above the wasteland city for a long time. However, as more and more barbarians poured out of the city gate, there was still no response from anyone or any sound. Thud! The helmet fell back weakly, and he leaned against the back of the chair again. Z slowly lowered his eyes, and gently waved his hand on the back of the chair. Boom! 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 As if they were waiting for his order, the cannon fire that had been silent for a short while sounded again. This time, the target was still the city gate, which was in the middle of the barbarians who were pouring out. A tragic scene played out once again. The barbarians were born with brute strength, but they could only watch helplessly as their companions, or even themselves, were sent flying into the air. They couldn't do anything about it. Bombardment, bombardment, and continued bombardment. Z was sitting on the wooden chair, and Zichen's soldiers were also advancing. Obviously, they wanted to break into the wasteland city with the help of the artillery fire. Although the barbarians expected that the city gate would be breached, it didn't mean that they were willing to let the Bran enter the city. This was a great humiliation to all the people of the northern wilderness, and it was also a disgusting stain that would never be removed from history. Therefore, even though the artillery fire was fierce, and even though they knew that they would die if they stepped out, they could only rush out of the city without hesitation. In an instant, blood, broken limbs, and dead souls filled the air. At this moment, the city gate of the wasteland city was like a human meat grinder, or a blood pool of azura. It didn't reject anyone, and it mercilessly swallowed one fresh life after another. Finally, boom! The city walls around the city gate collapsed like building blocks under the continuous bombardment of artillery. Huge rocks fell down with a loud rumble and crushed the barbarians below. A huge gap with a diameter of dozens of meters was opened up in the city wall. At the same time, the vanguard of Zichen's 9 armies had finally reached the gap, and the roar stopped abruptly. The indignant barbarians finally had a chance to fight, but soon, before they could rush out excitedly, they were pushed back by Zichen's soldiers who didn't have a single breath of life. At this moment, they finally understood why the tribes in front of them couldn't stop the 20,000 soldiers. They didn't want to retreat, they wanted to protect their last shred of dignity in the northern wilderness, but the fact was that they had no choice but to retreat. The so-called dignity was trampled under the feet of the soldiers of the 9 armies. 15 minutes later, when Z's wooden chair finally arrived at the city gate, the city gate was firmly under the control of Zichen's 9 armies. At this moment, except for a few dozen soldiers who were still 2 miles away from the city, suppressing the barbarian archers on the city wall who were trying to counterattack, the rest of the soldiers of the 9 armies had all rushed into the city. However, at this moment, puff! A purple light flashed across Z's face. He suddenly opened his eyes and spat out a large amount of purple mist. Finally, the poison that Z had been painstakingly suppressing finally broke out and completely took over his body. Huff! Huff! What followed was rapid panting. The sound was very weak, and the rise and fall of his chest became smaller and smaller, as if it would stop completely the next time. Seeing this, the city gate suddenly became quiet. The soldiers of Zichen's 9 armies slowly turned their heads and looked at Z, the man who brought them hope and personally led them into hell with glory. For the first time, there were emotions in their cold eyes. Regret, pity, helplessness. Along the way, they knew the condition of Z's body better than anyone else. They also knew that this famous man had finally reached the end of his life a few meters away from the city gate of the northern wilderness. On the other hand, when the barbarians saw this scene, they were stunned and couldn't come back to their senses. Z, is he going to die? Previously on the city wall, many barbarians had seen Z's sickly appearance. They probably knew that this demon who had suppressed them for decades was not in good health. But they never thought that in just a few minutes, this demon would die in front of them. Why? It was a very strange thought. When the barbarians realized that Z was going to die, the first emotion that came to them was not excitement and ecstasy, but uncertainty and emptiness. Ha ha! Z was laughing. His laughter was very strange and bitter. He looked at the city gate a few meters away, and then looked at the tallest building in front of the city. The setting sun sprinkled a few rays of light, and the roof tiles reflected a blood-red color. His eyes flashed and his purple lips moved slightly. Come out to see me. Every word seemed to be a long-cherished wish, but also a helpless sigh. As he turned around, his purple eyes drooped this time. His voice could no longer reverberate in the sky above the great wilderness city. He murmured so softly that even the 4 soldiers carrying the chair beside him couldn't hear him clearly. Marshal, looking at the lifeless body on the wooden chair, the soldiers of the 9 armies opened their mouths silently and slowly lowered their heads. Dead, dead. Dead, 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 dead. Phew! Z is dead. Compared to the dejected soldiers of the 9 armies, the barbarians had mixed feelings about this scene. Some of them were doubtful, some of them were so excited that they couldn't speak a complete sentence, and some of them sighed with emotion as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders, and so on. In summary, they were very excited. But at this moment, a scream suddenly sounded, and the fierce battle started again. It was the Purple Dawn 9 army soldiers who made the first move. At this moment, their eyes were no longer as cold as ice, but like balls of raging flames. They looked at the tallest building in front of them from the corner of their eyes, enduring and resolute. They didn't know Z's purpose, but that building could only be the location of the imperial palace in the northern wilderness. Only then could it be the tomb of the Bran military god. What they needed to do now was to carry Z into the tomb and put him on the throne. Right in front of them, the tallest building was under the imperial palace in the northern wilderness. A figure stood quietly in the shadow of the vertical column of the dome, looking in the direction of the city gate like a statue. Probably at the moment when Z closed his eyes, the figure seemed to have sensed something. His body suddenly trembled, and he raised his hand to support himself on the huge pillar beside him. Then he slowly squatted down while hugging his knees. Then, a drop of water dripped down and broke into pieces. Like the sound of the wind, a low murmur echoed in the empty palace. "I'm sorry." In the end, he broke through the gates of the imperial city and led the remaining soldiers into the main hall of the imperial palace. He sat on the throne and committed suicide by setting himself on fire. When the news arrived, it was like the sun rising from the east, sweeping away the evening mist of the world and revealing the brightness of the universe. After the grand border city was destroyed, the soldiers of the 4 lords suddenly appeared and the Purple Star Army quickly took over the 3 satellite cities, so there weren't any serious consequences. However, in the hearts of the Bran people, Z, the war god statue, had undoubtedly collapsed. That was the reason. It was just like a saying that had been spread before. No matter what Z's plan is, using the lives of tens of thousands of civilians, the situation at the front line, and the safety of the entire northern wilderness as a ruse is definitely a heinous crime. Furthermore, what kind of target would be worth such a price? Killing the barbarian war god? Or killing the northern wilderness empress? Isn't this bullshit? However, now, Z had used reality to slap the world in the face. Although it wasn't his intention, he did indeed kill the barbarian war god. As for the northern wilderness empress, although it wasn't mentioned, now that the barbarians had completely retreated, there was no doubt that their rear was affected. Furthermore, they had already broken through the imperial city of the northern wilderness and burned down the main hall of the imperial palace, which symbolized the highest authority in the northern wilderness. What else could be more humiliating than this? What else could they be dissatisfied with? To the northern wilderness tribes, this matter was a stain that would never be erased in the history book. However, to the Bran people, this was definitely a joyous occasion. In just a short period of a month, the Bran people seemed to have forgotten the insults and curses they used to say about Z. They directly turned the tables and put Z on the altar again. Moreover, he was infinitely elevated, almost becoming the number one person below the god of light. With such an irresistible trend, the Bran people naturally wouldn't choose to go against the current. In fact, they were the most excited group of people. Take the half-dead Bran king as an example. The barbarians' retreat was already a joyous occasion. In addition, during his term of office, Z had killed the barbarian war god and turned the imperial city of the northern wilderness upside down. Therefore, when people talked about these things, they would definitely add his name, the new era, in front of these things. This was what it meant to win the reputation in front of and behind him. Therefore, after confirming the authenticity of this news, the Bran people specially sent a message to the northern wilderness tribes. They proposed to exchange Tiu, who was captured alive in the grand border city, for Z's bones or ashes. To be honest, the Bran people were only trying to make this move to cater to the strong wishes of the nobles and the people. They didn't think that the northern wilderness tribes would choose to make this kind of exchange after suffering such great humiliation. But was this really the case? In fact, all of the Bran people who were ecstatic had overlooked a small detail. That was the source of the news about Z. Logically speaking, with what Z had done, regardless of whether the northern wilderness tribe could cover it up or not, they still had to try and seal it off completely. However, the current situation was that Z had just broken into the imperial city of the northern wilderness. 3 to 4 days later, the Bran people received the news without any delay. This news was very complete. It even included details such as Z entering the main hall and committing suicide. Without a doubt, such a strange situation could only mean that there was a pair of invisible hands behind all of this. The intention was also very obvious. It was to let Z's name in the Bran and win the reputation of the northern wilderness. Alright, after saying so much, let's turn our attention away from the Bran and quickly move to the northern wilderness. Oh, let's stop halfway and take a look at Sylvia, who was running through the mountains day and night towards the Bran. During the chase, Tang En and Sylvia were running in a straight line. Therefore, even though a week had passed, Sylvia had only covered half of the distance. Of course, now that Sylvia had recovered to her peak state, she was terrifying. At the edge of the northern wilderness, it would be fine if no barbarians encountered her. If someone discovered her whereabouts, the only result would be death. Therefore, it would only take a few more days for Sylvia to return to the Bran. On the surface, once Sylvia returned, the Temple of Light would definitely release Tang En's portrait to the entire Bran and search for him. Of course, Tang En had already taken precautions against this. He only showed Sylvia his disguise. However, this was not the main point. Perhaps even Sylvia herself would never have thought that her return this time would be a fuse that would cause a huge uproar. It was an eventful time. The continent was in turmoil. So, where was our protagonist now? A groan that did not seem to be due to pain, but instead, it sounded like he had suddenly woken up from a long sleep. Blinking, Tang En's brain was in a daze. It was also known as a memory lapse. His vision was completely white. White ceiling, white gauze curtain, white cotton quilt covering his body, and a familiar smell. Yes, it was disinfectant, huh? Disinfectant. Tang En's dazed consciousness instantly cleared up. Wasn't this AF** King Hospital? Did I travel through time again? Just when Tang En's brain was a little fuzzy again, a calm voice was heard. You're awake. Suddenly turning his head, he saw a familiar figure dressed neatly and with a neat hairstyle. Tang En touched his forehead and completely woke up. He did not travel through time. That was a meticulous old butler, not a nurse in a seductive uniform. I'm in the system space? It was no wonder that Tang En had his doubts. In the past, no matter what state he was in, he would always wake up in reality and not in the virtual system space. The old butler did not answer this obvious question. Instead, he asked again, You're completely awake? Of course. Tang En got up from the bed, lifted the quilt, looked around his body, and replied with certainty. Nodding, Okay, wait 3 seconds. Tang En opened his mouth in surprise. Then, he could no longer close his mouth. Ding, obtained 20 blood chi. Ding, obtained 20 blood chi. Continuous. Ding, congratulations to Assassin Tang En for completing the revenge mission and successfully killing Sesman. Ding, the system upgraded. Ding, blood chi upgraded. Chapter 608. Ding, ding, ding. A series of tinkling system prompts suddenly sounded out of nowhere. Some were about gaining blood energy, some were about gaining experience, some were about gaining titles, and some were about leveling up. The prompts continued for a long time, and Tang En was already petrified. After a while, the last prompt finally ended, and the system space returned to silence. Blinking his eyes, Tang En licked his lips dryly. With a blank look on his face, he asked, Why did you put them together? The old butler's expression did not change as he asked, How long has it been since you entered the system space? Tang En scratched his head and thought for a while before remembering that he had not entered the system space since he was chased by Sylvia. Wait a minute. A bolt of lightning suddenly flashed through his mind. Tang En opened his mouth with a face full of shock. He said hesitantly, Could it be because I didn't enter the system space, so I didn't receive any of these vitality and EXP before? What do you think? The old butler spread his hands and showed a rare expression of, You're talking nonsense. Tang En was furious. Isn't this cheating me? No, to be precise, this is self-inflicted evil. The old butler's expression became calm again. The system space is an independent existence. If the host doesn't enter the system, how can he receive rewards and punishments? In other words, do you want the system to control your external body at any time and place? Of course not. Tang En shook his head and denied it without thinking. His body was the original product, and it was not damaged at all even after the transmigration. How could he let an emotionless machine control it? Just as he thought of this, Tang En suddenly slapped his forehead and said angrily, Damn, you almost changed the topic. Old butler, why didn't you tell me this before? That's just basic knowledge. The old butler's expression was a little helpless, with a hint of disdain. You've been the system's host for a long time. Think about your previous experience. When did you not receive the blood aura and experience prompt after entering the system? Tang En was dumbfounded. He thought for a while and realized that it seemed to be true. Take the Thieves' Guild quest for example. Every time he entered the system after completing the quest and receiving the reward, he would hear the notifications about the increase in EXP and HP. Just as the old butler had said, these were just basic appreciation. However, because it was too common, Tang En had never thought about it. He always took it for granted that if he killed someone outside, the system space would automatically add blood chi to it. That's right, after he entered the system space, his vitality had indeed increased. As for the previous notifications, well, to be honest, because even if it was just killing a small fry, the system would not tire of calculating and broadcasting the result. Over time, every time Tang En entered the system space, he would automatically subconsciously block out the noise in his ears. Thinking of this, Tang En could not help but pick up the medical quilt to cover his head. His thoughts were complicated. Firstly, it was because of the lingering fear. He did not dare to think about how he had survived before. If it had been during a big battle, and he thought that his vitality had been full, the result would have been a tragedy. Secondly, it was because he was too ashamed to face anyone. Tang En often thought that he was meticulous and that his precise control over a small area was absolutely amazing. But now, he could even make such a big mistake with basic knowledge. It was really embarrassing, Although this mistake is very childish, it's also a good thing for you. And? A good thing? After responding in a muffled voice, Tang En quickly lifted the quilt. He first carefully observed the old butler's expression to make sure that it was not mockery. Then, his face was full of surprise. What do you mean? The old butler's expression was a little strange. Do you remember what you did before you lost consciousness? Before I lost consciousness. Tang En rubbed his temples, and the previous scene quickly replayed in his mind. He subconsciously said, I used the ghost body skill. F***CK. Oh no, my body outside. With a standard carp flip, he instantly turned over and jumped up from the hospital bed. His face changed dramatically. It was no wonder that Tang En made such a big move. It was really because the side effects of the ghost body were too great. If he had not been lucky enough to be saved by Josiah last time, he would have been hung in a ditch and become the feces of birds and beasts. Now that he thought of the serious consequences, he was naturally full of panic. However, just as Tang En stood up from the hospital bed, his body suddenly stiffened. His usual calmness disappeared in an instant, and cold sweat poured down his forehead. Because no matter how many times he said in his heart, "Withdraw from the killer system," the scene could not quickly change as usual. Waving his hand, the old butler seemed to know what Tang En was thinking. Don't try, you can't go out now. Why? Because your body outside doesn't belong to you for the time being. Probably also felt that this explanation was a bit mysterious, the old butler said calmly again. To be precise, your body is still under the control of the skill. Ghost body? Tang En instantly reacted, and his face could not help but turn uglier. The killing intent hasn't completely dissipated? Then my body. You won't die, at least not for the time being. The old butler gave a frightening answer, and did not intend to explain in detail. He said again, moreover, what's controlling your body now is not the ghost body, but the evil body. Evil body? Tang En did not feel at ease after hearing the old butler's words. He frowned when he heard it. After a few seconds of silence, he looked up and asked uncertainly, I have this skill? Tang En did not have the slightest bit of confidence in himself. If he could make such a big mistake with basic knowledge, forgetting a skill seemed to be within common sense as well. You didn't before, but you do now. Fortunately, the old butler's answer did not hurt Tang En again. I've told you before that the ghost body can be upgraded as long as the number of people killed is enough. The evil body is upgraded from the ghost body. Tang En suddenly realized that he did remember this. However, once the ghost body skill was used, it was not something he could control at all. Naturally, this included upgrading. Speechless, he shook his head. Ghost body. Evil body, what's the difference between these two skills? The difference is that the evil body's combat state level is higher than the ghost body's. At the same time, the skill time also increases from the ghost body's 5 minutes to 15 minutes. Of course, the blood chi required also increases from 3,000 to 5,000. Regarding the system's skills, as long as it was within the permitted range, the old butler had always been good at teaching others. As for the similarity, the evil body can also be upgraded. The more people it kills, the more powerful it will be until it advances. Of course, the backlash will also be more serious. How serious is it? Tang En panicked. Could it be that I can't get out now because of this skill? That's right. The old butler said calmly, your physical fitness is too poor. This is also because your assassin level is too low and your body has not been able to undergo a qualitative upgrade. On the other hand, your blood chi level is on the high side, which directly meets the conditions for casting the ghost body and the evil body. He shook his head. Although the evil body can help you solve the problem for a while, it is not something you can control right now. This is like a strong medicine, taking it will hurt others and hurt yourself. I was also forced to do this. Tang En rubbed his face, looking helpless. This was not a lie. His blood qi had soared several times, such as with Eunice and Sang Pu. It simply did not allow him any possibility of retreat. It was lucky that he could survive in the end. He shook his head and spread his hands. Then what will happen to my body in the end? There are two possibilities. The old butler was not vague. He said calmly, the evil body's skill state has a limited time. If your body outside can't survive, then you will completely become a killing machine for a period of time until you die of exhaustion. But if you can successfully survive, your consciousness will return to your body, and you can slowly recover. Tang En heard this and his heart moved. He asked, what are the chances of success? The old butler had obviously calculated, and said directly, 3 out of 10,000. Can I swear? Chapter 609. After the old butler's detailed explanation, Tang En finally had a clear understanding of the evil body's ability. In short, this was a strengthened version of the ghost body. It was powerful, but the backlash effect was equally powerful. Moreover, it would also subtly change Tang En's personality. It was a skill that was best avoided unless it was under special circumstances. Tang En also knew about the current situation of him being captured, and the main culprit was the evil body. If the barbarian soldiers had kept attacking at the mountain peak, Tang En would have died of exhaustion. However, the barbarian soldiers retreated in the end. Therefore, Tang En, who hadn't felt any murderous intent for 10 minutes, suffered from the backlash effect and fell unconscious on the spot. 3 out of 10,000. So I'll never be able to get out now? Tang En scratched his head, looking extremely conflicted. It wasn't that he was afraid of death, but what was his current situation? Was he in a vegetative state? Wouldn't it be better for him to take a stab? Shaking his head, the old butler said calmly, as I said, that childish mistake is a good thing for you. The reason why you couldn't resist the backlash effect of the evil body is that your body is too weak now. But don't forget, with so much experience and blood qi accumulation, you've already leveled up, and your body will also have a chance to improve qualitatively. Huh! Tang En was stunned, and then his spirit was suddenly refreshed. He immediately reached out and opened his assassin panel. System level, Professional Assassin Code, Tang En Experience Value, 5650/10,000 Blood Qi Value, / With a cursory glance, Tang En immediately noticed the changes in the top few columns of the panel. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He had finally become a professional assassin. It seemed that Sessman's revenge mission gave a lot of experience. Well, he had traveled thousands of miles and almost lost his life. It wouldn't be right if he didn't give some compensation. Wait. Tang En subconsciously squinted to make sure he wasn't mistaken. He pointed at the blood qi value full of question marks and asked in astonishment, what's going on? Ugh. Could it be that I've killed too many people and my strength is off the charts? Naturally, the old steward would not care about such a nonsensical guess. He said calmly, I was the one who locked your blood and qi value. Tang En raised his eyebrows and looked at the old butler. After being together for so long, Tang En naturally knew that the old butler had a very clear purpose in doing things. Since he did this, he naturally had his reasons. Sure enough, the old butler continued, although your physical fitness will be improved to a certain extent after the successful upgrade, it will still be extremely difficult for you to resist the effects of the evil body's backlash. Yes, the success rate is 1%. If that's the case, I'll have to pay a certain price, such as blood qi, to safely survive this crisis. Tang En nodded immediately. No problem. How much do I have to pay? 100,000. F***ck. Tang En was speechless when he heard this. He rubbed his nose and said with a wry smile, for the sake of my life, I'm not stingy. But the problem is, do I have that much blood chi? He scratched his head and thought for a moment before shaking his head helplessly. I remember that I only have a little over 30,000. That was before. The old butler looked indifferent. Think about the people from the Temple of Light and the savage cult that you killed in the canyon, and that Anglos, as well as the ordinary barbarian soldiers that you later killed in the siege. That's right. Slapping his palm, Tang En suddenly became excited. Tang En's surprise attack in the canyon had killed at least a dozen experts. Thinking of the huge amount of blood and chi he had obtained from killing Eunice and Sang Pu previously, Tang En's eyes immediately flashed with countless amounts of blood and chi. It had to be said that Tang En had made a ridiculous mistake before and almost got himself into prison. But now, because of this, he had accumulated a huge amount of blood chi, which ultimately helped him escape death. This was really a pity for the fickleness of fate. So, now you agree to pay 100,000 blood chi to offset the effects of the evil body's backlash? Tang En knew that the old butler's rather formal proposal was actually a question from the system. After pondering for a moment, he asked, "This is the total amount of blood chi? The kind that can never be recovered?" This question was undoubtedly quite necessary. The so-called total amount of blood chi was more than 30,000 that Tang En had before. If it was used to perform skills, then of course the blood chi would be consumed. For example, it would become 25,000. But this kind of consumed blood chi would automatically recover in the wee hours of every day, and it would become 30,000 again, not 25,000. In other words, no matter what, the total amount of blood chi would not change. But the price that the old butler was talking about was undoubtedly not this. It's the total amount of blood chi. The old butler's words shattered Tang En's fantasy and explained, the price to pay must be the blood chi that has not been recorded in the system. In this way, the consumption can only be the total amount of blood chi. Few understood. Tang En took a deep breath and nodded to show that he understood. Then, he bowed solemnly to the old butler. "Thank you." Although the consumption was the blood chi that Tang En had painstakingly obtained, if the old butler had not blocked the blood chi column in time and allowed the system to record it instantly, Tang En could only raise his head and sigh helplessly even if he knew how to be saved. The old butler's expression did not change, and he said calmly, "No need to thank me. This is the condition that you created yourself, although it was in such a childish way." Hiss! The corner of his mouth made a hiss. Tang En rubbed his nose and turned his head away. What an unlikable fellow! But for the sake of saving my life, I'll bear with it. After criticizing in his mind, Tang En said straightforwardly, "Agree." The old butler nodded lightly and did not say anything else. He waved his hand, and the blood chi column on the assassin's panel immediately changed. Blood chi value 660001000000 blood chi level. Level 7 special effects. 7 times increase, top deterrence, advanced defense penetration, advanced explosion, advanced internal invasion, intermediate creation. Even so, he still rose a level. The corner of Tang En's mouth twitched when he saw this, and he suddenly felt the pinch. One had to know that the total value of his blood chi was only about 30,000 before, but after the deduction, he still had 30,000 left, and because of this, he rose a level. As the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. After all, he had paid such a high price to save his own life. He just had to bear with it. But now that Tang En saw this scene and witnessed the rapid increase in the total value of his blood chi, he could not help but think of the 100,000 deducted. **CK. If I had that 100,000, I could have risen another level. Damn it. Bang. As if his heart had been cut by a knife, Tang En collapsed on the hospital bed. His whole body was weak, and he wanted to cry but had no tears. Really, who am I working for? It seems like I've worked for free this time. Pause for a while. He leaned back and waved his fist and swore, "Damn it, whoever touches the evil body skill in the future is AF * king grandson." The old butler glanced at him. "In the past, after using the ghost body skill, you also said something similar. Cough cough, life is hard, don't expose me. Actually, it's not like you didn't gain anything." The old butler did not attack Tang En again. He pointed to the assassin panel and said, "At least you've gained 2 titles." "Titles?" Tang En raised his eyebrows when he heard that. When he came back to his senses, he subconsciously blocked out the noisy system prompts again, but he seemed to have heard some titles. Climbing up from the hospital bed, Tang En's spirit was instantly lifted. The title system was good, just like the evil dog nemesis from before. Although the effect was a bit useless, it did not consume any blood chi, and was like an automatic passive skill. Sure enough, when Tang En looked again at the panel that he had only skimmed through previously, he saw a new column under the blood chi. Title system: Evil Dog Nemesis. With this title, ordinary watchdogs will retreat. Blasphemer. With this title, light will retreat, and the gods will also be under the sword. 1,000 kills. Glory medal, obtained by killing 1,000 people. Blasphemer. 1,000 kills? Muttering to himself, Tang En touched his nose. Although he did not know the specific effects of these titles, he could not help but feel a little touched when he saw that these 2 titles were actually symbols of something bloody. Blasphemer, without a doubt, was because he had killed so many masters from the Temple of Light with 1 shot. And 1,000 kills. It was just as the title described. It was impossible for the system to make a mistake, but Tang En was a little confused. Had he already killed so many people? There was no doubt that the answer was yes. Although the majority of the people here were killed in their ghost or evil state, it was indeed not wrong to count it as Twain's fault. Shaking his head, Tang En was no longer the graduate from a third-rate university with an inexplicable sense of justice. Although he did not feel any sense of accomplishment from the 1,000 kills medal, he was already numb. With a simple shake of his head, he cleared away all the feelings he had just now. "Old butler, what are the uses of these 2 titles?" "The title of Blasphemer will give you an advantage when fighting people from the Temple of Light. For example, the probability of blood aura breaking through defense is higher, and you can predict danger to a certain extent in close combat, and so on. There are some subtle things that you need to experience carefully. As for 1,000 kills..." Pause for a while. The old butler nodded slightly. "There are no practical effects now, but when you get more medals, you can exchange some things from the system, such as skills, statuses, and so on." Tang En nodded in realization, then grinned and laughed. "Haha, can I summon the dragon god if I get 7? Not every time he narrowly escaped death." Tang En was undoubtedly in a good mood now. Unfortunately, the old butler was still an old butler. As if he did not hear this joke, he dragged the assassin panel down and asked calmly, "There are some changes in the skill tree. Do you need to ask anything else?" His words were as plain and professional as ever, but the subtext was undoubtedly, "If you have anything else to ask, ask immediately. If not, get lost. I can spend millions every minute. I don't have time to talk nonsense with you." Tang En smacked his lips. He could not say anything for a while, so he could only look up at the skill tree system. There were indeed some changes, mainly in the addition of a few new skills. They were aura observation in the layout, shadow doppelganger in the concealment, infusion in the disguise, Empyrean blade in the killing skills, and status in the status. Well, there were no new skills in the status, but the 2 words, evil body, were scarlet and looked a little scary. After looking up and down, Tang En touched his chin. There aren't many new skills in the system upgrade this time. There will be fewer and fewer in the future. Looking at Tang En's stunned expression, the old butler calmly explained, "There are thousands of ways to kill people, but there is only one target. When you reach a higher level, the system's skills will only restrict you. It was just a shallow talk, but the truth was the truth. The system's skills were, of course, the product of countless trials and tribulations, but there was never a perfect object in the world. For example, in a battle, the situation one had to face was very complicated, and it was often something that happened in an instant. One skill naturally could not break through tens of thousands of moves. Of course, Tang En had not yet come into contact with these subtle things that were close to the Tao. Hearing this, he only had a faint feeling in his heart. But it was useless to think too much now, and it was very likely that he had taken a wrong path in his speculation. He came back to his senses, nodded, and said, "Well, old butler," then briefly introduced these skills. The old butler naturally would not object, and commented one by one: aura observation. See through mountains and rivers, gain insight into people. This skill is more mysterious. Small mastery allows you to immediately choose the assassination location at a glance. If it is large mastery, you can clearly sense the strength, danger, and so on of people or things. Tang En heard this and raised his eyebrows in surprise. Why does it sound like fortune-telling? More or less. It really is? No matter how many changes there are, it does not deviate from its root. It's just similar to heaven's perception, but this aura observation skill takes a different path and goes to an extreme. It's more suitable for assassins. Tang En opened his mouth and said subconsciously, "But isn't this superstition?" The old butler looked over calmly. In the present world, if someone tells you that there is an alternate world in the Shiza mainland, and that he has been there before, and that he has an assassin system in his mind, would you believe that? Then, would you think that he is superstitious? Tang En was speechless. All right, next. The old butler turned his head. Shadow clone, as the name suggests, is to create a clone. This clone is not a complete illusion. It has some of the strength of your original body, so the stronger you are, the more powerful the clone is. Tang En nodded. I understand. Isn't this just bringing along a weakened version of my underling? However, he was secretly overjoyed. He secretly thought that if he had to do something like this in the future, he would let him do it. It's not that simple. The old butler seemed to know what Tang En was thinking and shook his head. This is just a shadow clone, not a real clone. It can attack, but only attack. It will not accept other orders. Moreover, once the clone is damaged, you will also be injured to a certain extent. TSK. So you've invited an ancestor back. Hearing this, Tang En slapped his forehead gloomily, speechless. Of course, this was just a saying. This skill was not that useless. As long as its level was raised, its battle prowess would still be considerable. Take the battle with Sylvia for example. If he had such a clone by his side, even if he could not kill his opponent, he would have been able to throw his opponent into disarray. It would not have been a problem for him to take the opportunity to escape. Instilling means that the system will inject existing information into your mind. With this information, your disguise will not be exposed. What you need to take note of is that the system's existing information is what you have collected previously. Beyond this range, there is nothing it can do. Hearing this, Tang En was delighted. There's such a good thing? Then let's inject it now. Although he could freely move the system's information, he needed a name. Just like a computer, he needed to at least give a keyword for the other side to respond. Like this, it was naturally better to directly store it in his mind and touch it at will to generate inspiration. Now? Good, what kind of information should I inject? Tang En generously waved his hand. What kind of information is this? Of course it's the whole set. Sorry. The old butler spread out his hands. Instilling requires the total value of blood chi. You don't have enough information right now. Blood chi total value? Tang En blinked in a daze, then his face twisted. Damn. I knew there was no such thing as a free lunch. And what is that? I'll think about it. This Empyrean Bloodblade's name is simply amazing. Old butler, tell me. The old butler glanced at him. He did not expose Tang En's clumsy way of changing the topic and calmly said, Empyrean Bloodblade, in short, is a weapon condensed directly from blood chi. When completed, it can cut through space and destroy all things. Wow, it really is amazing. Tang En's exaggerated praise was not completely to cover up his embarrassing predicament. The dagger in his hand that was forged from black meteorite essence was indeed powerful. It had accompanied Tang En through countless big and small battles. It could be said that it had worked hard and contributed greatly. But it had to be said that the dagger as a whole had been seriously damaged. Previously, it was full of holes where the gem was dug out, but now it was the entire dagger, especially the blade. Before, Tang En had thought of creating a new dagger, just in case, but he had always been reluctant to part with this black meteorite essence. He did not want this problem to be solved by the system. Listen, it can cut through space and destroy all things. Cough cough, well, there should be some exaggeration, but as long as the level is increased, it will undoubtedly not be any weaker than the current one. After the introduction of the skill tree, the introduction of the system's upgrade was more or less complete. As for other changes similar to the blood aura special effects, Tang En was naturally aware of them based on the effects before the upgrade. It had to be said that although there were not many new skills in the system's upgrade, they were not useless, but each had their own merits. Tang En looked at them with envy, but now was not the time to learn. After pondering for a while, he asked, Old butler, has my body outside completely gotten rid of the evil body's backfire effect? Yes. The old butler nodded, but I need to remind you that you are now caught. Although your life is not in danger, it will be difficult to get away in a short time. And you can look at the hologram for the specific details. Okay. Old butler, you want to leave? Stopping and turning his head, the old butler looked a little strange. Are you sure you want me to stay here? After saying that, he directly opened the door of the ward and walked out. And Tang En saw this and scratched his head, a little puzzled. Then he shrugged and waved his hand to change the hologram, showing the scene of him entering the ghost's body. What's the situation? Why is it so mysterious? Chapter 610. The big screen gradually unfolded. All the actors were already in position, and the scene began to change. Tang En had once heard a saying in the modern world, but the source was unknown. Everyone is the director and protagonist of their life. And now, the existence of the system had undoubtedly made this originally abstract sentence concrete. Before the ghost state. How many days ago was that? Damn, it's been a week? Have I been unconscious for so long? Tang En changed the big screen to the familiar computer desktop, and then zoomed in infinitely. Only then did he realize in shock that he had been unconscious for a week in the time column at the bottom right corner. He shook his head speechlessly, then crossed his hands behind his head and reclined comfortably on the hospital bed, squinting at the changing scene in front of him. Oh, this is a feeling I haven't felt for a long time. TSK, old butler, why did you leave so quickly? You should at least conjure up a bucket of popcorn before you leave. There was no doubt that after a false alarm, not only was his life saved, but the system and blood aura both leveled up. Tang En was naturally in a good mood. But this kind of pleasant mood only lasted until here. And do you have to be so perverted? Forget about killing people, but to wash your face with blood, it's not your face. That's not right. This perverted person seems to be me. Forget it, let's go on. Chewing fingers. TSK. Skip this part. The corner of Tang En's eyes twitched as he commanded the scene to change in a flurry. It had to be said that Tang En in the ghost state was simply unrestrained. He did whatever perverted things he wanted, and even Tang En himself could not bear to watch. It was not because of disgust or fear. When Tang En interrogated people, sometimes the scene was even more bloody than this. But after all, it was done for a reason, and the ghost body was always pursuing such scenes, and never tired of it. This was a bit unbearable. Soon, the system's screen jumped to the stage of the evil body, which was the first meeting between Tang En and the other party's commander. Stop, zoom in. After giving 2 commands, Tang En looked at the frozen scene, his long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly. It's a woman? So she's the one who caught me now. TSK, what a character. Continue playing. At this time, Tang En, who was rolling all over the ground on the screen, had already stood up. The ghost body had disappeared, and the evil body had officially taken over the body. Slit throat? Tang En looked at the image of himself making a standard throat-slitting motion toward the peak of the mountain, and couldn't help but nod. This evil body is not bad, at least it doesn't look so perverted. Oh, he ran away. Very good, you're able to assess the situation. You're quite rational. What followed was the scene of evil body Tang En repeatedly breaking out of the encirclement in the towering mountains and precipitous ridges. Tang En couldn't help but admire it and nodded repeatedly. With his eyesight, he could naturally see that the current situation was different from before. It was clear that there was an expert who had set up a trap and was constantly reducing the space for escape. The evil body's response was also quite appropriate, unlike the ghost body which blindly slaughtered. Instead, it was very obvious that it was holding back, but it was always able to jump out of the encirclement before a greater danger arrived. This kind of wisdom, this kind of eyesight, even in a sober state, Tang En could roughly do this. Seeing this, Tang En couldn't help but slowly ponder in his heart. This evil body is not bad. It can raise the level of the battle state, but it won't lose its rationality and do crazy things. And, if I encounter this kind of predicament again in the future, it's also an option to give it to the evil body. So far, the evil body's actions had undoubtedly satisfied Tang En. But it was only so far. Hey, Sylvia? Haha. You also have a day like this. Tang En's eyesight was so brilliant that he could see Sylvia's predicament at a glance. He couldn't help but urge a few times. Go, what are you waiting for? Beat her up, beat her up. Yo, you're really going to do it. Leaning forward, Tang En's interest was completely piqued. He stared at the screen without blinking and then raised his eyebrows. She's dead so quickly? Oh, she's knocked out. Don't be like this, you should have teased her for a while first. There's no pleasure at all. Raising his hand in annoyance, Tang En now wished he could pass through the screen and replace the evil body's position. Then, he could catch Sylvia and give her a good beating, so as to release the sullen feeling of being chased by the other party day and night for more than 10 days. On the screen, the evil body had already picked up Sylvia and started running. Tang En was regretful, but he could only restrain his mood and continue to watch. It's just a knockout, so it shouldn't be over yet. TSK, don't tell me you want to find a remote place to torture her? Oh, this is really too evil. It doesn't match my usual noble personality at all. But I like it, hee. Needless to say, Tang En deeply detested Sylvia. Now that he could see her in such a difficult situation, his heart naturally felt very comfortable. Then, haha, I really found a hidden cave. Interesting, too interesting. My God, what's the point of fighting at this time? Fast forward, fast forward. The loud laughter suddenly stopped. Tang En blinked and stared blankly at the screen. After a fast forward, the scene of the evil body forcibly leaning over and kissing Sylvia suddenly appeared. He suddenly felt as if thunder was rolling. This rhythm seems a bit wrong. The facts proved that Tang En's guess was correct. And this rhythm wasn't just a little bit off. The scene on the screen was naturally the scene of the previous sealed cave in the steep valley. There were elements of coercion, eroticism, danger, and extreme humiliation. Tang En now finally understood why the old butler's expression was so strange just now. After a long while, a roar full of depression, entanglement, anger, and a trace of filthy excitement and other emotions rang out. What the f***ck? You really did it. Since you did it, you should at least finish it. What the f***ck are you trying to do with just a few hits? I'll be despised by her, you bastard. Bah. Let's take a step back and say that after finishing it, you have to kill her, boss. You can f***king pull up your pants and run away, but what about me? Wait, it seems like this is me. What the f***ck? F***ck. F***ck. Tang En was now completely furious. He grabbed his hair and wished he could lift himself up. What the f***ck is going on? Did I f***ck Sylvia? The body was, but the mind wasn't. Isn't this nonsense? Who the f***ck would believe it? In fact, Tang En, as the main body, naturally understood the thoughts of the evil body. It was nothing more than wanting to collapse Sylvia's faith and bring her eternal torment. But knowing didn't mean that he could understand. If the sober Tang En at that time, although he would also take liberties and humiliate Sylvia, it was only limited to the battle. This didn't mean that Sylvia wasn't charming. The key point was that Tang En wouldn't think in that direction at all. He only wanted to get rid of Sylvia, or directly kill her. However, there was no doubt that the evil body Twain naturally did not lack evil thoughts. It was indeed worthy of its name. In the end, it actually came up with such a scheme, and then it made Twain's original body take the blame. Tang En didn't dare to imagine what it would be like to meet Sylvia again. Sylvia had already made up her mind to kill him, and now she was humiliated like this. She was afraid of death and wanted to chop him into pieces every time she dreamed. After venting, Tang En no longer had a good impression of the evil body. But things had already come to this, and there was no use in regretting it. Shaking his head, Tang En waved his hand to disperse the light screen. He got out of bed and pushed open the door of the hospital bed. Then he couldn't help but be stunned. It turned out that the outside also looked like a deputy hospital. When he turned his head again, the wooden door that had just been pushed open had the words, "Operating Room," written on it. Click. The old butler was lying on a rattan chair outside, resting with his eyes closed. He glanced over when he heard the sound. This, that, cough, cough. The old butler's expression was as calm as ever, but Tang En now felt a little guilty. And most importantly, Tang En was sure that the old butler wouldn't let go of this opportunity to ridicule him, just like how he had tirelessly gossiped about him before. He pretended to look around and said in surprise, "Oh, old butler, your hands are simply amazing. It's exactly like a hospital. This is just a small clinic." "Oh, is it? Then the decoration is so gorgeous?" "Haha, of course it's losing money." After a few dry laughs, Tang En tried to find something to say. "Does this clinic have a name?" "It's called a small clinic. I used to open it." "Well, that's not what I meant. Think about it carefully. The decoration is so good, of course the business is good, haha." Tang En wanted to slap himself. Wasn't he asking for trouble? "It's okay." The old butler shook his head lightly and suddenly asked, "How is Sylvia?" "Here it comes." Tang En's body suddenly tensed up. His expression changed and then returned to normal. He said exaggeratedly, "Haha, what can Sylvia do?" Old butler, don't tell me you like Sylvia?" Well, although Sylvia is really pretty, it's impossible for you and her to be together." He made a painful statement in an attempt to gain the initiative, but the old butler acted as if he didn't hear it. He just looked over calmly as if he was watching a performance. Tang En couldn't take it anymore. He pointed at himself exaggeratedly. "Hey, what's with your eyes? Do you think I like, Sylvia? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.